Our symposium theme for today is on climate change and food security. I'm going to try to keep things organized today, but in starting, one of the things I'd like to begin with is a thank you to the late Frank Sposato, who was an economics major and a member of the Rutgers College class of 1973, who generously provided some of the support for this event today through an endowment to the Rutgers Climate Institute. So we'll begin with some welcoming words by Bob Goodman, who's the Executive Dean of the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. Bob, whenever you're ready.
Good morning, everybody. What a crowd, wow. I've never seen this room set up this way. That was actually a fire notice about these doors, so don't, if there's a problem, go that way, not this way. Huh? Oh, you can get out, but you can't get, I see, okay, I'm glad I raised that. Excellent, so no worries. As soon as he said that, I was looking for the exit off here. So I'm delighted to be here. You guys don't keep count on the annual climate symposiums, but this is what, 12th or 11th? Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah, which I tend to do. The climate program at Rutgers has really thrived over the last decade plus, and I'm delighted. I know many of the people in the crowd, so I see some extension folks here, which is great, and students. I welcome you. I have a few comments. Thanks, Marjorie, for helping with this. The 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. The 2015 Paris Climate Change Agreement. Yeah, we're in America, right? We're not part of this anymore. Stated the goal of, quote, holding the increase in the global average climate to well below 2 degrees centigrade, Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. In that agreement, world leaders asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to provide a special report to better understand the impacts of global warming within the context of the Paris Agreement. In May of 2016, Rutgers Climate Institute and the Rutgers Energy Institute together hosted an event entitled Climate Change Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, from the IPCC to New Jersey practitioners, where we welcomed Rutgers alum and chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Hussein Lee, who let us know this report was on track. Last month, the IPCC indeed released this highly distinguished and anticipated report, which helped further elucidate the consequences of global warming, climate change at 1.5 degrees and at 2. Some of the takeaways from that report are that global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade sometime between now to 2030 and 2052. If it continues to increase at the current rate, while climate models project robust differences in regional results and between 1.5 and 2 degrees. Not surprisingly, climate-related risks to health, livelihoods, food security, food supply, water supply, food security, I would add nutritional security, and economic growth are projected to increase with global warming of 1.5 degrees and increase further with 2 degrees. And then there's this really interesting work just out suggesting, because of course oceans are the drivers of a lot of this, that actually the accumulation of heat energy in the ocean is somewhat different perhaps than what the models actually show and use. Adaptation is expected to be more challenging for ecosystems, food, and healthy people at 2 degrees of global warming than for 1.5. So each time the Earth heats up an extra half a degree, the effects aren't uniform across the globe. Some regions, such as the Arctic, warm 2 to 3 times faster than other regions. The Mediterranean and the Middle East regions could see a 9% drop in water availability at 1.5 degrees and 17% drop at 2 degrees of warming. As a land-grant institution here in New Jersey, Rutgers University broadly, through the Climate Institute, the Energy Institute, Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences Institute, and the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, is intertwined with faculty who work in this area and as demonstrated by the rich tapestry of individuals in this room. It's closely linked to our experiment station's extension program and outreach programs. I heard a fabulous talk yesterday by Michael Catania, who many of you in this room will know or know of, talking about climate change and agricultural issues being tackled out at the Duke Farm Estate. And I'm calling on the leadership team and all of you to be mindful of what Duke Farm is doing, because it is parallel to and could benefit through increased synergies with the work that we do here at Rutgers. Understanding the effects of climate change on agriculture and the environment is an area that we're particularly focused on as well. So we know farmers in our region, many regions throughout the world, are having to adapt their current practices, including crop choices and agronomic practices, to a different climate marked by extreme weather events and changing seasonal patterns. I'm increasingly saying to people in the broader public, because climate change, of course, has become seriously politicized in some ways in this country over the past couple of decades. Today, if you want to learn about on-the-ground impacts of climate change and global warming, talk to farmers. It's very interesting. Farm producers are typically, and so in this state as well, rather conservative and very cautious. And in this state, in a significant political minority, but they are vocal. They understand more than many of us what's going on in the environment that they are completely dependent upon for their work. So that, I think, is an interesting thing, and I believe we're going to see, I think we're on the cusp of a change in the weight of understanding by the society more broadly of the importance of this topic, and particularly around food and food security and food production. Today, you'll be taking a deep dive into what climate change means for food security, especially as we think about how to feed 9 billion people by 2050. Although 2050 sounds like a long time from now, and for me, it does seem like a long time from now, those of you who are students by 2050 will be parents, and you'll have college-bound kids of your own. So think about that. I mean, the time between now and 2050 is a generation, a human generation. So I hope today that you'll be motivated to work together, reinforcing the already strong linkages amongst us, to advance our collective knowledge in this area, and to be ever mindful of the importance, the power of science and of observation and of improved understanding of natural history and the ecological dimensions of the world we live in, which is now undergoing this quite significant and threatening change. Thank you for being here. Thank you for doing what you do. And I think we'll have a great morning together. Thanks very much.
So thanks, Bob, getting us off on a good start this morning. I mentioned before that I'm co-director of the Rutgers Climate Institute, and it's my pleasure now to introduce my partner in leading the Rutgers Climate Institute, Robin Saylor from the Department of Geography.
Hi, everybody. Thanks. This is a great crowd today, and I'm really looking forward to the morning. I'm not going to talk very long because I think we have as many introducers as speakers this morning. So I'm just a quick comment. You know, the Rutgers Climate Institute is certainly a interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary entity. We have representatives from many schools, and I'm myself a social scientist. Tony is a physical scientist. And so we just want to kind of balance out the introduction, and we're going to hear from Ron Ransom, who is the Dean of Mathematics and Physical Science from the School of Arts and Science, for our second introduction.
So thank you, Robin. I wanted to follow up on one thing that Bob said, that this time where we were facing these problems seems far away for those of us who are a little bit on the older side. But I always am reminded my own grandfather, all my grandparents were born right around 1900, and my granddaughter was born just a little bit after 2000 and will likely be here in 2100. So in the time when we've gone from basically an agricultural society to facing the challenges that we're going to face are in the lifetimes of people we've known. I think that's an important thing to remember. And if I can make when I saw the title of this year, I have to say I thought of summer road trips with my son, where the complaint was always, "Dad, I'm too hot and I'm hungry." And sort of ironic that this child's complaint will be the complaint of this planet. I taught a course. I'm from the physics department. I taught a course with Tony Broccoli and others on energy and climate change for several years, and this made me keenly aware of how complex and thorny the issues of climate change are, and how it crosses so many areas of scholarship. As such, Rutgers Climate Institute has more than 100 faculty affiliates who come from 13 schools across the university in a broad range of disciplines, including the natural and social sciences, humanities, engineering, law, and medicine. The Institute's mission is to facilitate scholarship, education, and outreach on climate change, arguably the most important global environmental challenge we face today. Our annual symposia are an important element of the Institute's mission and our goal to stimulate interaction and collaboration among a broad community of natural and social science researchers and university students interested in climate change from institutions in the area. Although Rutgers has been hosting climate symposia since 2006, in 2014 we made a conscious decision to move toward a regional symposium, where our intent has been to foster collaboration among natural and social science researchers and students interested in climate change from institutions throughout our area. This is the 5th anniversary of our regional symposium. All of us at Rutgers join me in welcoming you, those of you faculty and students alike who represent 20 other institutions throughout the New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and District of Columbia. Your participation today is a testament to the breadth of disciplinary expertise that exists in our region in response to this extremely important issue. Today we have a diverse and highly esteemed group of scholars who are also thought leaders and will delve further into the issues around climate change and food security. After lunch, more of you will be sharing your research during the poster session. I want to once again welcome you and thank all of our distinguished speakers and presenters, whom I know will expand upon the challenges and opportunities related to climate change and food security. And I turn this back over to Tony.
Thank you, Ron. So we're about to have a terrific program, and before we get started with it, one order of business that I'd like to complete is recognizing the planning committee who put together the program for today's event. And as I mention your names, if you don't mind, you could just stand up or wave or something for those who don't know who you are, so that we get to give you a little bit of recognition for what you've done. Kara Cute from the Department of Human Ecology. Ethan Schoolman, also from the Department of Human Ecology. Ethan couldn't make it this morning, but please. Mark Robson is here from the Department of Plant Biology. My former classmate, we won't say what year that was. Zania Morin from the Department of Plant Biology. Brad Hillman, Senior Associate Director of the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station. Malin Pinsky from the Department of Ecology. Kivone Riney from Department of Geography. It's right here in front. And Dave Robinson from the Department of Geography. And finally, the incomparable Marjorie Kaplan, Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute. If anything goes right today, it's because of Marjorie. So I just want you to know that. If something goes wrong, that's probably my fault. So today's program is going to take us around the world. We're going to look at terrestrial as well as marine systems. And our keynote speaker today is well qualified to lead us off in this discussion. Dr. Alessandro Di Pinto will start us off by providing a global perspective on climate change and food security challenges. A little bit about him. Dr. Di Pinto is a senior research fellow in the Environment and Production Technology Division of the International Food Policy Research Institute, where he leads their work in climate change and is also their liaison. We're going to have a bit of acronym alphabet soup here with the CGIAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And CGIAR is a global consortium of international agricultural research centers engaged in research for a food-secured future. Dr. Di Pinto is an environmental and natural resource economist with 20 years of experience working in economically depressed areas. He has a PhD in agriculture and consumer economics from the University of Illinois and currently works on a series of climate-smart agriculture research activities in Latin America, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on agricultural risk management, resilience, and low emissions development strategies. His research focuses on economic spatial analysis, and he uses multiple modeling techniques to simulate the effects of policy changes on food security, resilience, and the environment. So I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Alessandro Di Pinto.
Thank you. Good morning. Just for the record, I think my mom is the only one that calls me Alessandro at this point. I go by Alex here in the United States. But thank you.
Okay.
I'm good? Let me start by thanking the organizers of the symposium for inviting me here to talk today. It's an honor and a pleasure. And also thank you for the hospitality and the wonderful dinner last night. It was equally pleasurable. And I'm here to talk about climate change and food security and give you a global perspective. I just wanted to say that I'm going to cover a lot of material, and there are a lot of different studies that I'm going to cover. And unfortunately, each study will probably require its own presentation. I'm going to just give you the highlights of all this stuff. And also, to give you some perspective of sort of the approach and what informs my presentation and my perspective, I have to say a few things about the International Food Policy Research Institute, the institution I work for. So the International Food Policy Research Institute, it's supposed to provide research-based policy solutions, okay, to promote the resolution of hunger and malnutrition. And how do we do this? We interact as much as possible with policymakers It could be ministries, it could be presidents, but also donors here in the United States and internationally, the civil society, the private sector. We're trying to inform them with sound research to inform their policymaking. Okay. And we work across the globe. We have offices mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia, but actually we're present in many developing countries. And we are part of this larger consortium of research centers that are promoting agricultural development. So we specialize on the economic side of sort of development, but we have other, and we collaborate with many other centers who work on sometimes just on a particular commodity, right, like rice or wheat, but also with foresters and so on. So our collaboration really covers a large set of topics. And we also work with other research institutions, like it could be Rutgers and other universities here in the United States, but also across the globe. So we tried as much as possible to create collaborations because, as you will see from my presentation, these problems are extremely complicated, and there isn't a single discipline that can solve the problem, okay? There isn't. So having said that, let me cover some of the challenges that we're facing and the type of agricultural development that we envision that must meet these challenges. And these are challenges that span time and geography. First of all, and I think we should not ever forget this, is that whatever agricultural development we put in place has to answer the needs of today. In the countries where I work, I come in contact with too many farmers that truly don't know how to make it to the next harvest season. And their livelihood can be wiped out completely by a single extreme event. And actually, even globally, it's not just my own perspective, but even globally, the numbers are going in the wrong direction again. The number of malnourished people and people that are at risk of hunger, they're increasing again. We're losing the ground that we had gained after the global food crisis, global food price crisis of the 2007-2008. When after that, there were a lot of investments and things picked up, but we're going in the wrong direction again. And it's true that sometimes there is enough production in the world to cover, hypothetically, all the needs of basically the entire world population, but then distribution, transportation, it's a problem in itself. And then if we think about diets, things become even more complicated. So talking about nutrition. At the same time, the agricultural development that we should aim at has to support long-term policies that are able to deal with the contingencies of climate change, of new climate change regimes. And this is a very important and often not talked problem. The time horizon of this decision-making is very different from the time horizon of election cycles, the time horizons of the stock market, the time horizon of farmers. And we have to try to find these sort of solutions that mediate across different needs. Global forces for change, domestic plans for development, the realities that are lived by people on the ground, in the farms. All those things have to be somehow negotiated, and we have to find these feasible possible options. And also these options have to be economically and politically sustainable in the long run. I think we all know what happens when you don't legislate actions towards climate change, and you actually do this through policies that can be wiped out very quickly. Example, United States. It has to address all these different needs, okay, in a potentially very different environment. I like this picture because it gives us a sense of how stable the temperatures have been along the period of sort of agriculture as we know it has developed in the last 12,000 years. And that can be very, very different in the future, dramatically different. At the same time, there are some mega trends, and climate change is just one of them. There are many other things that are happening on the globe that actually sometimes often overwhelm the effect of climate change. Now we have to contend also with deglobalization. It's a real problem. I mean, I'm an economist, and I know, but I'm an environmental economist, so I'm an economist with a heart, as I tell people. But it's true that we all think that trade is it's helpful in sort of dealing with many of these crises, while deglobalization would make our life extremely difficult. And an additional problem that I wanted to point out is this idea of it will be recurrent, I think, in my presentation, this idea of diets and nutrition. So we're dealing with this problem because of demographic transition and economic growth and so on, of changing patterns in consumption for agricultural products. And these are really dramatic. And they also, I mean, this is for the good because people have, higher incomes, they can afford better food, they can improve their nutrition, can get more healthy. But at the same time, they put an extra sort of pressure on our finite resource base, and we have to deal with that too. If you're here, I probably don't have to convince you that climate change is a problem for agriculture and has, some significant negative effects. And most of these negative effects will be felt by the poor. There is substantial evidence at this point about that. But it's important also to remember that agriculture is part of the problem. It actually is a significant source of emissions. And actually, it's about like a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. It depends on how you measure. It could get all the way up to almost 30%. And most of these emissions actually come from the developing world. So we have to deal with that. Some colleagues of mine have measured the contribution from the agricultural sector that we should have in terms of emission reduction in order to stay below the 2 degrees Celsius. And it's about 1 gigaton of CO2 equivalent per year. That's a lot. And you will see there are some significant problems in achieving that goal. Oh, one more reason to worry is the recent report from the IPCC. There are many bad news in that report, but I like to focus on two that struck me particularly. It's the fact that it's all but certain that we're going to reach the 1.5 degree warming in sort of our lifetime, hopefully. And also that this 1.5 degree warming looks very much like the 2 degree warming as we thought it would be. So it's really bad. And all of this actually has increased the cost for carbon tax, which is, for economists, is good. You internalize the externalities of, the social cost of having emissions. The problem is that several studies that have looked at the effect of including a carbon tax in sort of globally to achieve sort of 2 degree or 1.5 degree sort of threshold to stay below, actually show that there is a significant penalty that comes from that reduction, the increase in prices, some agricultural commodities, and therefore sort of increase in malnutrition and hunger. These are significant numbers. I think we're about between 80 and 300 million people that would suffer because of these taxes. So solving these problems, okay, creates always trade-offs, right? And this is problematic. And again, most likely it's not us here in the developed world that is going to suffer from these higher prices. We'll probably have enough money to buy more expensive things, but in developing countries, this is a serious issue. So let me walk you through some of the perspective that we provide as the International Food Policy Research Institute through our modeling, our research work. So how do we think about the future and this role of the work that we do for foresight modeling? Well, first of all, I'm a modeler, and every modeler knows that most models are wrong, one way or the other. Although we don't like to think this, admit it, but the truth is that even if they're wrong, sometimes models are useful. And we have moved away from models that provide forecasts or predictions, and we are fully based on scenarios projections at this point. They have significant advantages, and one of the most important is that you can cooperate with your the people who would have to buy into these changes that are promoted by potential policies promoted by the modeling. So they can interact with the scenarios. They can form their own scenarios. They can make the scenarios their own. And particularly when you make this modeling fully transparent, open, and flexible, our experience is that the models that should never be a black box, they become extremely useful in informing policymaking. So we do a lot of work to open up. We provide public goods and open up these models in a way that people can interact directly with them. The models are becoming increasingly complicated with teams of scientists, from many different disciplines. And this is just a picture. I don't expect you to. We're not going to go through it, but the reason I'm having it there is because now the model that we use for our climate change work actually is made of 12 different models. These are teams, from water models, land use models, livestock models, economics, and so on, that come together to try to make this good. And then we provide information about land use, full economy effects, greenhouse gases, biodiversity too. Which all our modeling starts from information that is provided by the IPCC in terms of themselves are scenarios in terms of shared representative concentration pathways and shared socioeconomic pathways. These are scenarios in terms of economic growth and population growth and so on, and concentration in terms of greenhouse gases. That is our starting point. In this case, the representative concentration pathways, they inform our climate models. The climate models will give us, temperature changes and precipitation changes globally. And then that information is fed into crop models, so models that try to model crop growth for the most important crops, although we're missing some locally important, like teff, for instance, in Ethiopia. We don't have a good model for that, and so we don't even talk about that. But when I go to Ethiopia and I don't talk about teff, it's a major problem, right? So we have to find ways around that. And then the crop models give us, changes in yields that are caused by changes in temperature and precipitation, and that together with our assumptions about economic growth then feeds into the economic model, which ultimately will give us changes in areas, in harvested areas, changes in in availability of food and prices, and so on. And so we can say things about hunger, we can say things about poverty, and also the environment. Another way to look at this, one more slide on sort of this sequence that the modeling sort of follows, is we choose a particular representative concentration pathway, and then that gives us maps on changes in precipitation and temperature, and then we choose a timeline. Normally we work with 2050, but recently Gates Foundation has asked us to work on 2100. So they're starting, finally, Bill Gates is interested in sort of seeing what happens in climate change, too, because so far he hadn't put any money on this. Then these changes are fed into the crop models, again, which give us maps, geographically disaggregated maps on changes in yields, and then fed into the economic models that gives us changes in productivity and changes in incomes and so on. Now, you can see the many steps, and I'm sure many of you are working in one or many more, maybe several areas, and you know how much uncertainty, how many errors. You can see how the errors accumulate, right? This is why we work with scenarios. The scenarios are basically to create contingency plans. It's not a projection. And we know, and I just wanted to point out again, because Ethiopia, it's fresh in my mind because of some work that we just finished there. So we all know that there are significant problems with our climate models and their projections. For instance, I don't know if they have resolved this one recently, but last time I checked, there's still an issue. All the historical data is for Eastern Africa is pointing to getting drier, but all the models are pointing to getting wetter. Then when we feed all this data in our models, it seems like things are going to get better for Ethiopia, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So lots of problems. We're aware of that. So what are the general effects when we look at several models together? Several climate models, the results from several climate models and different projections. So climate change will cause a negative effect on yields. It will, to respond to an increased demand for agricultural products, there will be an increase in cropland, a harvested area. And in general, we project production to actually decrease somewhat, okay? And this is where lots of people are focusing in my sort of community. But what is frightening is this, so the change in prices, right? Because that is one of the main determinants of hunger and malnutrition and risk of malnourishment. Another slide to show you the effects of climate change. This is with the timeline is 2030. This is a little difficult probably to interpret, but just to give you a sense of what is happening. If you look at the distance between the gray circle and the orange circle in that diagram, that is sort of the gray circle is the effect on nutrition or malnutrition with climate change, and the orange is without climate change. So that shows. So if you look at that distance, you see that that distance is different in different parts of the world. And it's particularly bad for sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and in other parts of the world it's not so bad. But it is there. We can see significant danger for access to food products. And now the forefront of our research is moving towards nutrition. So it's not just calorie count as it used to be. So we're doing a lot of work with nutritionists to see how the changes in climate, changes in productivity, sort of affects the availability of nutrients and micronutrients. And so we can determine areas of risk, but also we can determine where people should invest, make investments to have better varieties, maybe fortified agricultural products, and so on. And in fact, one of the works, recent work that we did with Oxford, showed that the importance of nutrition, actually they were able to show that the climate-related deaths associated with reduction in fruit and vegetable consumption was twice as important as the climate-related increases of death in the prevalence that comes from underweight people. So nutrition is extremely important. We have just started to scratch the surface of this problem. What are our available responses? Well, we know, all the research is pointing to the fact that the current consumption and degradation of natural resources and ecosystems exceeds the regeneration rates. And it's pushing us against what we call the planetary safe boundary, the safe planetary boundary. And I want to point out that solutions like we had decades ago, sort of the Green Revolution, which was purely focused on the production side, on making better varieties, they're probably almost certainly not sufficient to answer these multidimensional problems that we're facing. In fact, some of the work that we have recently finished shows some of that. We have looked at different investment scenarios. So where should we invest to improve the conditions of the environment, to improve economic growth, food and nutrition? And we looked at investments in research and development. We looked at investments in water management and irrigation, in improving market efficiency, mostly infrastructure and road construction, and then a comprehensive scenario. Now, again, we don't have time to go in fine detail across this table. I wanted to point out two things. So these are the types of investments. The first one is on research and development. This one is on irrigation, and this one is on infrastructure. Two things I wanted to point out. First of all is that there are trade-offs. So you invest in one area, and this is particularly true for irrigation. When you invest in irrigation, you improve certain metrics, but you have, say, for greenhouse gas emissions, they become really bad. It's a very similar situation for investments in road construction and better access to markets. It increases GDP growth, better nutritional outcome, but as far as greenhouse gas emissions, it's not good. And also I wanted to point out that the best investments seem to be in research and development, and research actually is showing this over and over and over, that in developing countries, the best thing you can do is to invest in research and research and development for agriculture. But those investments, those blue sort of become darker farther and farther in time. So again, that time horizon that I was talking at the very beginning, the payoff, it's farther in time. That creates problems for a politician who wants to get reelected, for instance, right? Some of the key findings of this study, and not just this study, but in general, all the studies that have focused on this global outlook, that population and income growth will drive growth in demand and changes in diets, and food and nutrition, though, because of economic growth, are projected to improve. So in general, there's an improvement globally in the metrics of nutrition and food security. Climate change will slow down this progress. So it doesn't make it impossible, most likely, okay, but it slows it down significantly. Now, I don't want to minimize this because, again, for a lot of people, this slowing down actually can be catastrophic. So this is a global outlook. I want to remind you about that, okay? So when you go in specific realities, things can be really bad. So market and trade, can help and mitigate the effects of climate change, the negative effects of climate change. Agricultural research and development plays a critical role. But again, this idea of trade-offs, wherever you invest, most likely there is some trade-off in some other areas. And you get your best results when you actually act on multiple sort of areas together, which obviously increases the cost of doing that. I want to go back to that idea of the reasons to worry, and particularly the idea of the carbon tax, because I want to talk about a little bit of why I think that actually they're wrong. I think that they're overestimating the negative effects of putting in place a carbon tax. And I want to introduce to you, I don't know, maybe you're familiar with this idea of climate smart agriculture. It's a new approach, relatively new, probably is the new kid on the block after conservation agriculture, integrated soil. So climate smart agriculture was actually introduced first in around 2009, 2010 by FAO, and it considers 3 objectives at the same time, okay? So we're moving away from this idea of just increasing productivity. So now it's about increasing productivity sustainably, it's about increasing, building resilience and increasing the adaptation capacity, okay, to climate change, and also reducing greenhouse gas emissions when possible. We know that in any negotiation, we're lucky that after the Paris Agreement, COP23 actually, finally agriculture made it into the negotiations for greenhouse gas reductions through the Coronilia joint work process. But nobody wanted to talk about agriculture, ever, because when you talk about those things, food security, it's a thing that countries do not want to put on the table. So finally, agriculture is on the table, but when you talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's always a problem. But climate smart agriculture actually tackles this issue, okay? And it provides this, it's a framework, it's a way of thinking about the problem that it's applicable by decision makers that span from the farm level all the way to the ministries and sort of the country level. And it offers a set of guiding principles to identify technologies and management practices that enable farmers to meet the challenges of producing under a changing climate. And it does this by considering the trade-offs. So as I said, there's always this constant threat of the trade-off. So you look at the trade-offs and you make your decisions. Often, in many of the environments in which sort of I work, this is boiled down to just a set of practices that, sort of no-till or alternate wet and dry. So just a set of practices that you use at the production, on the production side. But to do that actually is a mistake and creates tremendous limits on the potential to deliver. In fact, most evidence, my own research, but not just IFPRI, most evidence that I've seen points to the fact that you have to think bigger than just field-level activities. Just starting from, if you think about it, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, often people talk about crop production, and crop production might not be a problem at all when you are in presence of, when you're in a country where there are significant amount of resources like forests, where the whole game is about protecting the forest. And so agriculture is only a problem insofar that it encroaches into those kind of environments. But also work that I actually did in Colombia, we started, this is work on low emission development strategies that the country of Colombia wanted to explore, and they wanted to see how you can reduce emissions while preserving economic growth. And they also started with the idea of acting on their crop production. Because again, food security, it's a major issue, right? Well, we could quickly, through the modeling, but we quickly found out that actually, if you want to reduce emissions, you just have to work on your livestock sector. Livestock sector and the interface with forest. And that generates sort of that sort of upper left quadrant. It's a sort of win-win kind of situation in which you have reduction in emissions and economic growth. That's where you have sort of economic growth and reduction in emissions way more than sort of if you just try to protect the Amazon forest, which actually, you have even less reduction in emissions and a cost economically. Or some of the plants that we're trying, really, we had to fight against the lobby for the palm oil lobby because they wanted to expand palm oil, oil palm. And we showed to them that there is a role, but it's very limited. They wanted to expand it, can't remember, 2 million hectares. And we showed that, it's not a good idea if those are the objectives. However, then, our role ends here, right? So we provide the information, people can sort of have the discussions on how to formulate policies, but then they will have to make their own decisions. Similarly, this is work that we actually have in progress. I hope to be able to submit the paper next week. So these are fresh results. We showed that even climate-smart agriculture, when it's interpreted as acting only on the production side. So we looked at wheat, maize, and rice. It's only 3 crops, but it's 41% of the harvested area globally, and it's 64% of emissions from crop production, so it's significant. But when you intervene on these crops, on the production side, with some of these, what I consider climate-smart agricultural practices, they deliver best-case scenarios. If every farmer were to adopt it, about 10-13% of that 1 gigaton goal from the agricultural sector that we're talking about. So it's very limited. And if you actually factor in a limited adoption, which is probably more likely, that you get the green dot towards the bottom, that is most likely result. So it becomes increasingly negligible, the effect. Also, work that we did with IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they are promoting this forest landscape restoration sort of approach, which is integrating agriculture into forest restoration. Again, these are 2 camps that normally don't talk to each other, that finally come together. And we showed through our work that when you combine forest restoration in landscapes together with climate-smart agricultural practices, you have tremendous benefits in terms of reduction in people at risk of hunger, but also gain in carbon stock and so reduction of emissions. Another forefront of the research that we're doing is in combining all these things together. So we are increasing. I don't know how much you interact with donors like USAID or IFAD, International Fund for Agricultural Development. They're becoming more and more integrative in terms of concepts. We probably are aware of resilience. And resilience, it doesn't deal only with production, but it deals with resilience on many different levels, right? And we have very limited understanding of how, say, productivity is limited by gender issues, the nutritional factors. Nutrition actually affects productivity in a feedback mechanism. So we're studying that quite a bit these days, actually. We have a framework to think about this stuff. It helps us in thinking about where we should collect data, and where you have to put sort of indicators and metrics to measure things. But this responds to one of the issues. When I started working in development, I started as an agronomist many years ago. And at that time, we already had some practices that we knew that were beneficial, but farmers would not adopt them, right? Then I go back to graduate school, and I start teaching. I get back into the world of development about 15 years later, and we're facing exactly the same problems. We know that there are many practices, many things that farmers could do, they don't do it. Well, probably all those barriers are not just on the economic side, risk, but there are lots of social issues that need to be addressed. And this hopefully is going to help us with that. So let me conclude. Some takeaway messages. There are significant opportunities to offset the negative effects of climate change, and they spur economic growth and economic development and well-being. And also they protect ecosystems. There are a lot of new technologies that actually bring a lot of hope, CRISPR, new crops that can significantly alter sort of the situation we're dealing with. And I also want to point again that most likely those negative sort of projections in terms of the effects of a carbon tax, I think that they tend to overestimate the negative effects. And so we have an arsenal of opportunities that actually could reduce emissions and increase productivity. But to meet the goals of these new treaties, like the Paris Agreement and others, our framework, we have to work in a more integrative way, and they have to be inclusive. They must be enriched with system thinking, interaction of agricultural land with carbon-rich environments like forests, mangroves, include agroforestry, silvopastoral systems, and think through the value chain. So we can't just focus on productivity, although it's important, but it's not the whole story. And we must recognize the multiple pathways through which nutrition, health, gender, and equality influences the set of responses that are available to farmers. We need to understand that better, and we've just started. And so often I've been asked this question, well, it seems like there's a tall order for farmers. They have to deliver all these different sort of metrics, and that's probably unfair to them. So can we have it all? And yeah, I flip the issue, and I say, well, we shouldn't look at sort of increased productivity, better soils, improving ecosystems as an output of something that you do well on the production side. But those are actually part of the solution. Better soils, better ecosystems, those are part of the solution from the very start. So we need to take that into account. And all of this to say that we tend to create silos in which we work. And it's almost inevitable, and particularly in an academic career, you need to publish, and well-respected journals probably don't like you to wander too much far from sort of specific issue that you're attacking. But even policies are developing silos. And that's a major problem, because these multidimensional challenges, they will not be solved if we keep working in those settings. And they need to have coherence across policies and multi-sectoral plans. And so approaches like agroecology, climate-smart agriculture, forest landscape restoration, sustainable land management, and so on, we all have our own preferred one. And sometimes we become very protective, but actually, if you move away from your little turf, you'll see that they're all equally important, and most of all, they're important because they force us to move away from this single objective attitude that we often apply in our research. And they reinforce this idea of multi-objective approach to agricultural development, but also, and this is my personal experience, these are methods that can really favor a dialogue across ministries, which is essential to develop coherent policies that attack and respond to climate change. Thank you. And I just wanted to mention, as usual, there is one person here talking, but there are many, many other people behind this work that make all this stuff possible. Thank you again.
So thanks, Alex, very much. What we're going to do now is have our first question and answer session of the day where you can ask Alex some questions. By the way, notice it's Alex now.
I noticed that. I was smiling. Thank you.
My brother is about the only one left who calls me Anthony, so I do understand. Our tradition here at our Rutgers Climate Institute events when we have question and answer sessions is to allow students to come up and ask questions first. So those of you who have questions, we'd like you to do two things. First of all, let the students go first. And secondly, come up to the microphone so that we can hear you throughout the room and so that we can also get your question recorded as part of the video that we're doing here. So if you have questions for Alex, come on up to the microphone. Don't be shy.
Sure you have questions. Come on.
We'll just stand here awkwardly for a minute until someone gets ready for a question.
Coming up, can I just?
I haven't seen you in any of my classes, but
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
We'll
let
I
you
am
go.
still a student, though.
Yeah.
I have a lot of faculty to learn from. To quote a famous politician, who knew it was so complicated? Two quick things, Alex. Great talk. One is a comment about teff. Agronomically, that might be a confounding species or crop, because as I understand it, it grows quite well in arid conditions at high elevations, and it also grows at equatorial low elevations. So it's got an amazing range of potential growth, and I don't know how tightly that's tied to genetics, but I think that the G by E interaction actually in teff is pretty liberal. So that's just a thought. Some years ago, I think it was Ken Kassman at a AAAS meeting, I remember talking about a paper that he and I think it was Jonathan Foley and David Tillman did. And I bring this up because you didn't really mention education. And one of the things that they, as I recall, showed in this paper, or argued in this paper, and Ken definitely made the argument in the talk, was that in any agroecosystem, the best farmers outproduce the average by something in the range of 50%, suggesting that in any agroecosystem, know-how is a big factor in the ability to produce. And I wonder if that is true still in the thinking of people like yourself. The three of them are not agronomists, or not economists. So that's my question.
Could I address it, Rob?
Sure.
Thank you for pointing to education, which is obviously is an important issue, but it is way more complicated than that in the sense that education of whom? So who gets that education? And then we'll go back to the education falls into that sort of complicated, not so complicated, but framework that combines gender issues and nutrition. So who gets that information makes a tremendous difference. And the response, it's not the same across genders. And if you factor in youth, the education actually means that they leave the field and they go somewhere else, right? So yes, I mean, as usual, the common sense reaction is that yes, you increase education and some farmers will perform better, and that's probably true. But it's also true that some farmers will take their knowledge somewhere else and will do something completely different, which it could be fine for resilience purposes. Well, there's more, but yeah, I'm going to let other people ask questions, but it gets really complicated. And again, you know, a lot of this is also very new to me, and I owe like a tremendous amount of sort of information to the people that initially, as a modeler, I work with econometric models, so I always found this stuff, you know, so soft. Things that, you know, I don't see numbers, and what do I do? But, you know, I think they're definitely onto something, and just because it's hard for us to measure or put it inside a model, given that, you know, we haven't had incredibly great results, we better change something.
Thank you, Alex. So I'd just like to go back to before your speech and the quick point about how we're only 4 or 5 generations removed from a mainly rural society here. And what maybe those kind of changes, you referred to megatrends, might factor into thinking about sustainable rural livelihoods, resilient rural livelihoods in the future. I mean, not identical and at a different pace, but certain similar transitions are happening in sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, have happened. Does a sustainable rural future look like one where broadly the same proportion of people now are employed in agriculture, are farmers, but they're not hungry? Or is it about enhancing agricultural productivity, whether people are in urban areas, in rural areas? I mean, do those things factor into the models? What does, for you, a sustainable rural future look like?
Yeah, okay, yeah, great question. It's actually a very good question. Yes, we're thinking about those issues, particularly, again, in countries in sub-Saharan Africa where the plots are becoming smaller and smaller and smaller because of population growth. And so, yes, you know, there's some literature that says, you know, you're more efficient with small plots and some metrics. But to be honest with you, there is a limit to that thinking in terms of providing food to a growing population. And also, if you're serious about, and this is a controversial, what I'm about to say, it's controversial, but if you're serious about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're way better off with bigger farms. So it's, again, trade-off. Right? It's a problem, but it's a trade-off. Because of your capacity of investment, you gain all sorts of efficiencies along sort of with size. What we're thinking mostly is that there has to be a transition, there has to be a transition away from agriculture, from a significant amount of population, away from, again, production. Part of the work that we're doing with youth, people tend to think about youth as just, you know, we're going to give these people mobile phones and a tablet or whatever, and they're going to be better farmers. Well, that might change here and there, some uptake of some practices, but I think it's, again, you know, we're working on this, so I don't have evidence. We're really, it's an issue that we're active. I think there's higher likelihood to have sort of an effect if we make people see agriculture not just as production in the field, but think about the whole food system. And so there are plenty of opportunities of working in commerce, moving things around. You know, the information around prices in some countries is dismal. I mean, and so and so that's where we're going in terms of involving youth, and so moving them away from the farms, that are becoming increasingly smaller, right? And offer opportunities that are still related to the agricultural sector, but it's not just the hard, so you have to remember this, the hard field work. There is a reason that most people want to leave the field. Most people, not everybody. Some people that really enjoy are feeling connected, it's beautiful. But most people, they want to leave, and they have the right to do so. I remember one of the last things that I taught when I was still teaching, I did a back of the envelope calculation to see what it would mean for the United States to have sort of a type of farm that would fulfill sort of demand for food products here in the United States. At the same time, it would look like, there's a famous farmer, William Salton. I think it's a famous sustainable farming system that this guy has put in place. Well, back of the envelope calculation, we need like 2 million people who go back and work in the farm. Well, that's, can be tough. So, it's tough work, but there is equally important work that can be done across the whole food system. It doesn't have to be necessarily in the field. It can be equally important, significant, and contributing to emission reduction.
Okay, before the next question, we're running a little over, but we still have time for a couple more questions. But let's try to keep questions and answers as concise as possible so we can get as many of them in. Thanks. Go ahead.
I'm going to try to shorten my answer.
I'm Michael Goschfeld from the medical school, which is a school that does not particularly value ecology. I thought this is a wonderful example of Rutgers global reach. You covered a wide variety of domains that intersect, but one that I didn't hear much about was population, which seems to me is very closely tied to agriculture, both in gender roles, farm family size, people leaving the farm. What can you say about that?
Not much. This is going to be a very short answer. There's a reason I didn't mention those things, because it's not my area of work. So all the assumptions about population growth are they come from our sort of IPCC scenarios, and we don't mess with those things. So we only think the population growth we consider only in terms of what that means for changes in diets. And it's very limited, and I acknowledge that. But this is why collaborations again are so beneficial, because these are complicated problems, and in order to make them enrich them, we need to have kind of input from people that. That's the other thing. We normally, working with nutritionists, for instance, was a major undertaking. We speak 2 different languages. Just to start communicating and understand what the other person was saying, it was difficult. It took a lot of time. And so if you have the funds, if you have the will, if you have the people who are interested, you can build that connection. But it is a connection that needs to be built.
My colleague and I, Dr. Moran and I, teach a class in food waste. And food waste has a large impact on climate change. Would you comment on how that factors into the models?
Right now, it doesn't. This is another area. I'm not personally active. And actually, IFPRI, it's also, I think there is only one person 2 people who are working in that area. But the wider organization, the consortium, actually is looking into that, particularly for the reduction of emission side. Again, with this idea that you really need to work on multiple ends to solve the problem. I can't tell you much except for the fact that at this point we are certain that that is part of the solution. It's just that to do it, it's daunting. We know how difficult it is to change consumers' behavior. It's difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. It takes a long time, investment, and there's also you're also going against the sort of the inherent right to make those decisions, right? So it only comes with education, which takes a long time.
Although it's not just at the end of the cycle, it is all during the
Oh, yeah,
entire
oh, yeah,
food system. So that's why you need that system.
Yeah.
Hi, Zania Morin. Alex, you talked about having 14 different elements to your models. Are they weighted in the, when I think about limits to growth, I think about water, I think about running out of fertilizer, particular potassium, phosphate. And so how do you balance out all the different models that are coming into your model system?
With difficulty. And depending on who has the louder voice. No, we try. I mean, all this stuff. It's all the models come together. They're not weighted in the sense that we don't consider potassium, for instance, limits in potassium right now. But if that's an issue that we should consider, we should definitely sort of do that. And with a lot of negotiations, so that's how you solve the problems. But these models, I mean, it takes a lot of work just to make them talk one to the other. But there isn't any form of weighting on or considering one more important. Well, of course, it's a cascading factor, right? So, for instance, water, then it limits a lot of, which we work at the basin level, it limits a lot of the options and the potential for growth and yield growth that then the model will spit out at the end. So some of these things are factored in, but there are lots of limits, and again, that's why we make them fully open, and they're complicated, but they're completely open and potential and transparent. So if a person wants to contribute and experiment, obviously we have to have the money then to do something about it, but we're totally open to this form of collaborations. For instance, one of the things that we're working with now is not only the changes in nutrients of food that is caused by climate change, but also we had a person from Davis a few days ago that gave us a presentation about the risk from arsenic in rice. I was completely new. So these are all things that potentially, I mean, they might be way more important than the things that we're measuring, we just don't know about. And we need to factor them in.
One more question.
Hi. Earlier in the presentation, you had that study showing that the carbon tax would increase food prices,
Yes.
but you say that you don't think the effects will be that much. I was just curious why.
Yeah. So those are not our studies. So there are two studies that I found that have spoken about those particular effects, and we go in sort of a little bit in the weeds of the model. So you have to read the supplementary information that is provided sort of aside, and they only consider in their modeling sort of a generic productivity growth in the agricultural sector, and not the potential for switching to these practices like the climate smart agricultural practices that I've been talking about that actually can deliver in increasing productivity and reduction of emissions. So of course, all this, if you put a carbon tax that it's high enough, it will have a negative effect on you will have carbon farmers, right? Which might be really bad for food security. But in the realm of possibilities, okay, I think, again, because of the way they have modeled growth in their agricultural sector without letting farmers to switch to these alternative practices, they tend to overestimate these negative effects. There might be no negative effects at all. Actually, first of all, I'm very much supportive of a carbon tax, and also I think that if we are capable of working on the food system and not just on the productivity side, we have plenty of opportunities for increasing the efficiency and reduce emissions and produce more.
Okay, well, let's thank Alex again for a fine talk. Could you, yeah, we're just out of time, but maybe you can talk to Alex during the break. So we do have a break coming up, and we have food outside in the Fireside Lounge. So please feel free to help yourself to coffee and whatever may be left over from breakfast, if there is anything. We'll be reconvening again at 10:45 to begin our panel discussion. So that's about 15 minutes from now, so we'll see you then. Each speaker is going to present for 15 minutes, and at that time, we'll invite, after all four presentations, we'll invite everyone up for some directed discussion and then some questions and answers from the audience. Now, one of the things that can be really challenging based on previous years about these panel sessions is 15 minutes is not very much time for someone who's very knowledgeable and passionate about a subject to get their message across. But unfortunately, if we're going to keep things moving, we have to keep things to 15 minutes. So I'm going to try to play the role of the time cop here today. Josh is going to help me because he's giving cues to the speakers about how much time they have left. If it gets to the end of 15 minutes, then I'm going to stroll up here on stage and stand behind the speaker in a vaguely menacing way in the hope that that will keep things on time. So please forgive my apparent rudeness, but that's what we need to do to try to keep things on time. So what I'd like to do first is, and for the sake of time, I'm going to introduce all four speakers, and then we'll get started. So our first speaker is Pinky Mondal from the University of Delaware. She is a geospatial scientist interested in examining human-environment interaction using remote sensing and GIS tools with a specific focus on the sustainability of agricultural ecosystems. Pinky received her PhD in geography from the University of Florida, and she's been at UMass Amherst, the City University of New York, and Columbia University before joining the faculty at the University of Delaware. She has a broad research interest in climate change impacts and adaptation, with research interests in Asia, Africa, and the United States, focusing on agricultural sensitivity to climate variability, adaptation strategies in stakeholder farmer communities, and the effect of national level policies on forestry and conservation. After Pinky is done, it will be Malin Pinsky's turn. Malin is an associate professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources. So he's my downstairs neighbor at work because our departments share a building. Malin is also an Alfred P. Sloan Fellow in Ocean Sciences. He leads a research group studying the ecological and evolutionary impacts of climate change in the ocean, and he developed the Ocean Adapt website to document shifting ocean animals in North America. He's published articles in Science, PNAS, and other international journals, and his research has been receiving coverage in places like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, BBC, National Public Radio, and other media. He's also one of the members of the Rutgers Climate Institute featured in the latest Rutgers magazine. Malin received his PhD from Stanford University and an AB from Williams College. Our third panelist is Rachel Besner-Kerr, who's an associate professor in development sociology at Cornell with a background in environmental science, anthropology, and international development. She currently serves on a project team of the United Nations High-Level Panel of Experts on Food Security and Nutrition, which is examining the potential for agroecology to address food security and nutrition. She will be a coordinating lead author for the chapter on food for the next IPCC report. In her research in Malawi and Tanzania, she uses participatory methodologies to test the impacts of agroecological approaches on livelihoods, nutrition, sustainable land management, and the resilience of rural communities. She recently co-authored a paper that examines the knowledge politics on climate change in Malawi when using a participatory and agroecological methods with smallholder farming communities. And then finally, Kevon Riney is an assistant professor in our Department of Geography here at Rutgers. His research is situated at the nexus of critical development studies, human environment geography, and political economy. Kevon's current research explores the socio-ecological and justice dimensions of global environmental change, as well as the science policy interface shaping climate change adaptation efforts in the Caribbean. He has recently co-edited 2 books, Globalization, Agriculture, and Food in the Caribbean, Climate Change, Gender, and Geography, and Global Change in the Caribbean, Adaptation and Resilience. Kevon is also editor for Geography Compass, an editorial board member for the Royal Geographical Society, Institute of British Geographers Wiley book series, and the Caribbean Geography Journal. He's also a contributing author for the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius, which Alex was just discussing in his keynote. Kevon has provided technical assistance in rural development and sustainable agricultural issues for several international and regional agencies, including USAID, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, Inter-American Development Bank, World Bank, Global Environment Facility, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. So, somebody maybe should have come up here and warned me that I was taking too much time, but we are done with the introductions, and now I'd like to invite Pinky Mondal to come up and begin her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Can all of you hear me okay? Just coming down with a cold, so forgive me. So today, thank you for joining us here today. I'm going to talk about smallholder farmers in India. So who is a smallholder? He could be this old farmer who is preparing his field just before the monsoon or the wet season coming up, and he's hoping that it arrives on time. Or she could be this lady who could not plant a second crop in her field because monsoon, or the time the monsoon rain, it arrived late, pushing the harvesting date. So even though she had resources to plant a second crop, thus increasing the food security of her family, she could not. And for this very reason, many of the smallholder system in India and elsewhere would have these patchy appearances where you would see some fields are cropped and some are not. By definition, smallholders own less than 2 hectares of farmland. So we are looking at very small to small sections that cover a lot of regions. And they're important in global food production because they provide together almost 70% of food calories, and also over 50% of staple crops. Now, this map is showing you the mean agricultural area across the globe. And you want to focus on the orange and red because those are the very small or small holders. And if you can see, if you follow the color, they are focused in this region, Southeast Asia. My research is situated in the context of the smallholder agricultural system, where I use satellite remote sensing and GIS to study how weather variability impact the smallholder system, how are the socioeconomic factors are actually affecting, and how these all give us some ideas about how to improve the overall well-being, specifically focusing on food and nutrition security in these farmer communities. Much of my work is focused in India, and the reason for that is, other than I am from India, so I do have a better knowledge of that system, but also over 55% of Indian population, they are somehow linked to agriculture. They are not all farmers, but most of them are somehow linked to this. And 78% of Indian farmers are smallholders. Yet, 210 million are hungry. Now, if you remember from Alex's presentation, that's almost 1/4 of the global hungry people. So if you focus on this area, this system, and if you can solve, and wishful thinking, but if you can solve that, you are solving 1/4 of the entire global problem. Now, this map is showing you the groundwater availability for 2025. The take-home message from this is that it's not good news. What you want to focus on this map is the orange and red. Those are the low availability of groundwater. Why it's not a good news, especially for agriculture? Because in India, 60% of the irrigation is provided by groundwater. Although we have only 37% of agricultural land that's irrigated because rest of it's rain-fed, but remember, when we say it's irrigated, we also have the rain-fed, which also focuses on the rainwater, like the timing of the rain coming in. So our studies indicate that if you do not have enough groundwater to support your second crop, which is the winter season or dry season, there's a chance there will be 29% of less food crop. And that's important for food security nationally, but also globally. So if I were a smallholder farmer in India, what would I be concerned about? First, I would be very concerned about the timing of monsoon, especially if I do not have access to irrigation and most of my farms are rain-fed. I'd also be thinking about what are the crop choices do I have? Should I go for rice? Should I go for wheat in my winter season? Or should I go for something else? Third, I would be very concerned about the price I will get by selling those crops. And fourth, but probably most importantly, is that enough to feed my family? Because of course it's all about family, right? So if you follow that chain of thought, you'd see that many of those are actually linked to weather variability, timing of monsoon, type of crops that would be resilient to changes in climate precipitation, rainfall. So rapidly changing weather patterns, it is one of the biggest challenges that smallholders are facing in today's world. So the research questions that I am interested in, it's mostly three, broadly. First, the impacts of weather variability. Second, potential adaptation strategies. And third, how we can utilize all this information and make sure that there's enough food and nutrition security for these farmers, because they are providing food for everyone. So I think it's our responsibility to make sure that they are secure, not just from the food perspective, but also for nutrition perspective. Today, I'll just focus on the first question. Now, how do I do that? Well, of course, by modeling, but not as complicated as the ones from Alex's talk. From my perspective, I'm a geospatial scientist, so I work with satellite images. So the first thing for me is to extract crop signals. I use that using time series signal, so satellite images, crop signals out of it. I also use satellite images to get my climate information, temperature, precipitation, but I do tend to get out to field, talk to farmers, get field data on crop types, whatever irrigation they're using, and also I get to play a little around with the socioeconomic data, which mostly comes from census. Now, if you have ever worked with all this kind of data, you would probably acknowledge how difficult it is to make sure that everything is in line and they're put together in a statistical framework. But going back to my satellite images, what exactly I'm doing with those images? So satellite images, you can think of it as your phone taking a selfie. Right? If you zoom in too much on a satellite image, you will see little pixels or those squares, right? So each square, each pixel has a value. I'm looking at those values. So for crops, I'm specifically looking for a peak in the value. So if you follow this picture, this graph, these blue dotted lines, they denote one single year. If you get one peak within those, like 1 year, that means that particular pixel has only one crop planted. That's giving you the signal. And if you follow the bottom panel here, within 1 year, we have two clean signals, two clean peaks. That means that particular pixel had two crops. So that's very simplistic way to put it, that we are literally collecting crop signals from each pixel from satellite images. We use different satellite-derived indices. The one that's shown here, it's called Enhanced Vegetation Index. It's a proxy for vegetation greenness. It can be used for forest. We use it for crops. So when we are looking at the peak, what are we looking at? We are literally trying to understand if there's a low point in the entire time series. This is showing just one season, but we do it over multiple years. So for one season, if there's a low point, that's literally starting your season, and if you have this over, just a curve going over and then going down just before harvesting. So looking for the peak, and it's important that it follows this curve because otherwise it's not a crop signal. So based on where we are, we use different types of satellite data. Some places are very heterogeneous and it requires very high resolution satellite data. Some places are more homogeneous. So for example, if you're working in the US or Brazil, you are probably okay with dealing with more broad or moderate resolution satellite data. In India or other developing countries where we have more smallholders, it's a very heterogeneous system. So sometimes we have to kind of going with the trade-off where we follow either like how large a system you're working on, how large area we're focusing on. So we do work with many different types of satellite data. The ultimate goal is to get a map. I'm a geospatial scientist, right, and a geographer. So get a map each year for the time series that we are focusing on. So the graph here, the map here, is showing you the variability throughout this time series of 2001 to 2016. What you want to know from this map is all these green areas, those are stable double crops. So the farmers there, they have been consistently planting 2 crops throughout this 16, 17 years. All the orange and red, they are kind of fluctuating. Some years they plant a second crop, some years they don't. Now, if you know anything about India, these green areas, they are in the IGB sector, the Indo-Gangetic Basin, also known for very wealthy, commercial, large farmers. But I'm interested in the smallholders who are basically showing fluctuations. Now, that's where I start. That's my starting point. But I also incorporate in my model climate parameters. So this is just showing one variable that I use, that's total monsoon rainfall. But using different types of climate data, satellite derived, I also calculate other indices like start date, monsoon end date, what was the intensity, number of rainy days, both for monsoon and for winter. Not just precipitation, temperature too, and I'll show you why in a couple of slides. Temperature is also very important, so I also utilize temperature data like daily temperature max, daily temperature mean, many others. The idea is to basically put all these data together in a space-time data cube, right? In this cube, the z-axis would be the time component, and the x and y would be the location. The size of this cube will depend on what kind of satellite data you are using. Remember, we are dealing with a statistical model, so probably you would want to know about the sample size. Now, if I'm utilizing a moderate resolution satellite data, I'll probably be dealing with something around 2 million pixels. If I'm using a very coarse resolution data, I'll probably be dealing with somewhere around 4,000 pixels. So that's the sample size for this, this type of statistical model. Now, what do we get out of this model? Well, this is a very simplistic graph that's coming out of one of the models. Here, we are looking at 2 different regions. On your right, we have a Western India site, and on your left, you have an Western India site, and then on your right, you have a Central Indian site. These sites are different in terms of what kind of irrigation they're using and the resources they have. I wanted to examine if, the type of sources of irrigation has anything to do with their thinking or their practice, that if they are going for a second crop. So what you need to know from these graphs is this dotted line, that's a 0 line of significance. The further you move away from that dotted line, the more significant role that variable play in the choices of planting a second crop. If you go left of this dotted line, that's a negative impact. So if you just compare these 2 graphs from these 2 regions, you will see in both these graphs, the winter daytime mean temperature is coming out as the most negatively significant factor that's affecting the choices of a second crop planting. Now, if you look at the other variables, in Western India, it's probably the monsoon rainy days, the number of rainy days, whereas in Central India, it's the total rainfall and also the number of rainy days during winter. Remember, we are thinking about the winter crop, the dry season crop. So the central Indian side, they do not have access to groundwater as much as they have in the western Indian side. So in the central Indian side, they do depend on winter rain. So the main finding from this study, this portion, was that, of course, depending on where you are, you will be more or less resilient or not so to climate variability. But no matter where you are, temperature still plays a very important role. And irrigation sources would play a very important role because some of the surface irrigation, for example, canal, stream, that will directly depend on the amount of monsoon rainfall. So if you're in a place where it's mostly dry and you do not have access to groundwater irrigation, you might not go for a second crop. And for that reason, I wanted to focus, if that's the case, what would be a good crop option for these farmers? So I focused on central Indian side who do not have access to groundwater as much as they have in the other part in India. We focused on these two crops, which is wheat and pulses. So I don't know how many of you know about pulses. It's just another name for lentils, you can say. So it's a group of crops like chickpeas, pigeon peas, lentils, moongs. And these two crops are the most common winter crops in this field. And having the same type of modeling framework, what we learned is that temperature still remains critical, no matter what crop you are choosing. Now, wheat is definitely more affected compared to pulses. And so what we found out that pulses could be a potential option in terms of changing, responding to increasing temperature, but we also think that there could be other strategies. For example, just shifting the planting date, because we see that there are more like temperature rising at the end of the harvesting. So if you can move the planting date a little bit or use some early maturing crop varieties, that might be a good strategy. Now, is that the only one? Is the temperature or the climatic parameters are the only factors affecting these? No, we also found the smallholders actually tend to travel to nearby towns during winter to get more money. So off-farm income, seasonal labor migration, it's a great way of boosting their income. So, of course, if we have more irrigation, would that help? Absolutely, but would that reduce the variability or the sensitivity of climate, sensitivity to climate? Probably not. So some of the ongoing work I'm trying to do is also look at how monsoon crop is responding. So this is from Vietnam, and this is great because we are using radar data that will give us more opportunity to look at the time series. But we are also looking at if these alternate crops that we are recommending to these farmers, would that help with the food and nutrition security. So this is just preliminary result from an ongoing study that I'm leading right now. And as you can see, most of my respondents, they eat rice, a lot of rice, not so much fruits or vegetables. So when I'm trying to get some recommendations from them, for them, while I'm working and collaborating with agricultural economists and nutritionists, I'm trying to understand if that would make sense in terms of improving this family's food and nutrition security. Thank you for your attention, and it's an honor to be here.
Thank you, Pinky. So we'll have our panel after all of our four panelists have an opportunity to speak. So next up is Malin Pinsky.
Thanks, everyone. So my name is Malin Pinsky. I'm a professor in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources here at Rutgers. And I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about and talking about climate change, the oceans, and some of the unexpected consequences that we're seeing. You know, most of us don't see the oceans every day, so it's easy actually to overlook their importance for people. And yet, globally, 1 in 4 people, 4 in 10 people alive today rely on fish as an important source of protein from animals. Fisheries employ about 50 million people around the world, and seafood is actually a very important source of micronutrients as well. So back to the point about nutrition that's come up a few times today. Seafood's a very important source of nutrition as well. So what happens to the ocean, what happens to seafood actually has very direct impacts on people. And as ocean temperatures have been changing, we've been seeing dramatic impacts on ocean life. Some of the most dramatic actually have been shifts in the distribution of marine species and shifts in where they're found. Just going to show you one example here from the Northeast US. So we are here in New Jersey. We've got North Carolina down here, Canada up here, just to orient you. And so black sea bass are a popular recreational species that's caught off the coast here, also very important commercially. And areas in red on this map show where black sea bass were especially abundant in the late 1960s. Fast forward to 2014, and they shifted north about 500 kilometers to this point where they're abundant off the coast of Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts. We're seeing impacts not just on one species, though important for fisheries, but actually many different species. Each of the orange arrows here shows the shift in the center of one of the marine animals off our coast. The base of the arrow shows where they were in the 1960s, and the head of the arrow shows where they were in 2008. The average across all these species is that heavy red arrow, so about 20 kilometers per decade to the northeast, shifting for species in our region. And here in the Northeast US, actually, ocean temperatures have been warming faster than almost anywhere globally over the last decade or so. So it's part of the reason that we're seeing such rapid impacts in this region. In many ways, we're sort of on the front lines of seeing impacts from climate change and climate variability. We zoom out to look at North America overall. Again, each of these small colored arrows is showing the shift for a single species, but then that heavy black arrow is showing the average shift across many different species in each of these regions, from Bering Sea down to the Gulf of Mexico and all the way up the eastern coast to Newfoundland and Labrador. So we're seeing shifts north, south, deeper, shallower. But actually, a lot of that variation among regions and among species can be explained by changes in temperature in each of these regions. So in many cases, we're seeing marine fish and other marine animals shifting to follow their preferred temperatures. What I want to talk about today, though, is actually results from collaborations between my lab and with a number of social scientists. So includes Kevin St. Martin in the geography department, Bonnie McKay in the Department of Human Ecology, as well as other colleagues. And what we've been trying to understand is, what do these changes in distribution for marine fish mean for fisheries, so the livelihoods, the people who are trying to catch these, as well as how do those changes in behavior and those adaptations that people are taking then feed back to affect the resource itself. There are very important feedbacks actually in both ways. So Kevin and folks in his lab have been doing interviews all the way from North Carolina up to Maine with fishing communities to understand how they've been adapting. And we see that in some cases, fishers and their boats are traveling farther. Other cases, they're switching to new ports. They're sometimes switching to new species that are now more abundant in the areas that they fish. And in addition, some fishers are also just leaving fishing altogether. The choices that they make, though, are strongly incentivized by the regulations, the rules and regulations they operate under, the economics that go along with these different decisions, the costs and benefits, as well as the technology that they have access to. Especially here in the Northeast, though, we've seen an especially strong impact from regulations and the ways that these fisheries, the rules are set up to govern these fisheries, which, for the most part, were not set up with climate change or even climate variability really in mind. So I just wanted to show you one dramatic example. If we zoom in on Beaufort, North Carolina, it's a port with a large number of relatively large fishing vessels. And in the mid-1990s, so about 25 years ago, they were primarily fishing off the coast of North Carolina. This hollow square shows the center of, or the average location of their fishing trips in the mid-90s. Now, fast forward to 2014, they're primarily coming up to fish off the coast of New Jersey. It's a 500-kilometer one-way trip, so round trip, 1,000 kilometers, so 600 miles. Higher fuel costs, trips that could have been a day or two or now can be a week. And yet, they're doing that because, in large part, they're catching summer flounder, a species called fluke as well. Again, popular recreationally as well as commercially. And as you can see from this, the red areas on this map, summer flounder are especially abundant now off New Jersey and actually farther north. So one of the questions might be, why are they coming up here and then going back to North Carolina? Why aren't they just landing this fish in New Jersey or other ports that are closer to where they are, where they're catching the fish? And part of the reason actually has to do with the way the regulations are set up in this case, which is state by state, where the quota overall across the fisheries is then allocated for each state. North Carolina and Virginia have the two largest quotas. And what that means is that the fishers can catch summer flounder wherever they want, but they have to bring it back to the state where they have a permit. And most of those permits are in Virginia and North Carolina, others in Rhode Island and New Jersey. And this allocation was decided within a Fisheries Management Council, which is actually a group of stakeholders that come together and decide on the regulations for each of the fisheries. We have actually quite a participatory process in the United States for setting up fisheries management. But what they decided now about 20 years ago, a little more than that, was that they would come up with this allocation based on where summer flounder were in the 1980s. And that hasn't been updated since. And for that reason, most of the permits are in North Carolina, and the boats are coming up to catch summer flounder further north and then going back to North Carolina. There are ongoing decisions or ongoing debates about whether or not this should be updated. But in essence, this fisheries management system has set up political boundaries at each state border. And one of the things we're starting to see consistently is that when fish move across these political borders, there are challenges and even conflict in some cases. One of the things that happened just 2 years ago was the New England congressional delegation wrote quite a strongly worded letter to the fisheries managers asking, or to a certain extent demanding, that the fishers further north up in New England get more access to this fishery. Obviously, though, if that happens, though, it'll take away from someone else, and that's why it becomes such a political decision, and also very, very difficult. And in this case, it's led, in many cases, to just deciding not to do anything and to leave the system the way it is. We've also seen this starting to play out internationally. So an interesting case is Atlantic mackerel, which about 10 years ago actually moved north into Icelandic waters. Historically has been caught primarily by European Union and some other countries. And Iceland decided to start fishing for mackerel. European Union decided to continue fishing for mackerel. They didn't want to give up what they'd already been catching. So that combined catch together led to overfishing. Means that the population size goes down, there's less food for everyone, there's less fish to catch. It's not as profitable as well. And yet the two parties could not agree on how to share what would be a sustainable level of catch between those two groups. In this case, what started in fisheries didn't stay in fisheries either. It actually spilled over into trade war between Iceland and the European Union, and apparently has contributed in part to the decision by Iceland to no longer try to join the European Union at all. So it spilled over to really affect international politics, not just an issue about fisheries and fish catch. And I found this sort of quote from a study a little while ago especially striking. A large proportion of the militarized disputes between democracies in the post-World War II period actually involve fisheries. So they're a common source of dispute between countries out in the high seas or out in the ocean. So, we're seeing, as I've showed you, at least many examples where fish moving across political boundaries are causing challenges for fisheries management or even conflict. And one of the questions that I had was, we're underprepared for fisheries moving across these political boundaries, but one of the questions I had was, how much of a problem is this or will this be going forward? Is this a small problem or potentially a large problem? And so, teaming up with a number of colleagues as well as climate scientists, we looked at projections from global climate models and what they say about the location of suitable habitats for a wide range of marine species that are important for fisheries. So conditions like temperature, as well as oxygen, proximity to sea ice, and other aspects of habitat. So we looked at 892 species that are important for fisheries around the world. And then intersected that with a map of political boundaries for the ocean. So these are exclusive economic zones, the 200 nautical miles near each country that are in many senses controlled by those countries, especially in terms of fisheries. So we look for cases where habitat for a species will shift across a political boundary. And so this map here shows in red every place where there's likely to be a new transboundary fishery that is not transboundary now, but in the future will need to be shared between different countries. And at least one, but even more than 12 in some cases. And what we see is that it really is likely to become a global problem, not just a problem in Iceland or some places on the east coast of the US, but all over the world. And if we look on this graph here on the x-axis, which actually is probably hard to see from the back of the room, but we're going from, we have atmospheric temperature increasing on this x-axis, increasing to the right. And as global temperatures increase, the number of shared fisheries goes up as well. So the fewer greenhouse gas emissions that there are, the less we emit, the less the global temperatures go up, the less potential for conflict there will be over fisheries. And these two lines, the red line is a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario, so called RCP 8.5, and the blue line is a low greenhouse gas emissions scenario, RCP 2.6. There are also, though, adaptation solutions that are starting to be talked about, but only just starting to be talked about. So on one very basic level, we're still in the process of building that scientific understanding for what changes are happening and what changes are going to be happening going forward. That process of sharing data, sharing knowledge between different countries, between different fisheries management agencies, actually can be a very important process for building trust and shared understanding on which political negotiations can be based. Here in North America, my lab has put together a website called Ocean Adapt. Tony mentioned that before, oceanadapt.rutgers.edu. And not only do we track the current distribution of a number of marine species, but we also have projections of where species are likely to be in future decades. If you're interested in exploring, check it out. On top of that, though, it's not just shared data and knowledge, but actually then that has to lead towards shared oversight and actually joint agreements on how to limit fisheries catch from populations that become newly shared. And basic ecology tells us is that if we're fishing too hard, then the population size goes down and the amount that we can catch goes down as well. Those negotiations, though, are tricky, and yet we do have some good examples of countries that have shared fisheries successfully in the past and that have mechanisms for adjusting in response to climate variability and climate change. One of them actually has to do with the US and Canada. They jointly manage a number of Pacific salmon species on the west coast of the US. And at times when Pacific salmon have shifted more into United States waters, Canada has let the US catch more, but in return, the US has actually paid into a salmon habitat conservation fund. It's sometimes called a side payment, but basically it's a mechanism for reciprocity so that the benefits aren't only flowing one way when there is a change in the distribution of a species. Norway, actually, and Russia have other but related mechanisms for sharing species that are transboundary between those two countries as well. There's also some really interesting examples from the Western Pacific. A number of the small island nations that are parties to what's called the Nauru Agreement actually have a system of tradable permits set up for tuna. So each country has permits, but then they can sell or lease them to other countries if tuna are more abundant in another country's waters. So that system ends up being actually quite flexible, and the party that's losing out in terms of fish also gains something in terms of the proceeds from either selling or renting their permit. They also update their allocations. One of the challenges, though, is that tuna are projected to move farther into the eastern Pacific, and many of those countries, including some of the distant water nations that fish in international waters, are not parties to this agreement, and at least so far have not been interested in joining it. So just sort of take-home messages from what I've been telling you today. I think in many ways we're underprepared for fisheries on the move across political boundaries. We've seen that it's caused conflict in many cases in the past. And yet, that's very much happening right now and going to continue happening going forward. Fisheries are set to move across more than 70 new national boundaries by the end of this century. And yet there are adaptation solutions out there. We do have tools and approaches that can be useful, though they are not at the moment being applied very widely. So with that, I just wanted to thank a wonderful set of collaborators, folks in my lab who make doing all this research a lot of fun, and the funders who make it possible. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Malin. Our next speaker is Rachel Besner-Kerr from Cornell, and I will try to get her talk up better than I did last time. I hope so. There we go.
Thanks very much, and it is a real pleasure and honor to be here. I'm very delighted to have been invited and to be sharing the podium with such interesting and esteemed colleagues. So today we've heard the kind of global picture and some of the themes that Alex touched on. You're going to hearken back to in my talk, and we went to India, then we came back to the United States, and now we're moving over to Malawi and Tanzania, where I've been working for the last 20 years or so. And hopefully this will give you a little bit of a hopeful picture for thinking about climate change and food security, or at least some possibilities for what directions we might go in with regards to smallholder farmers. And some of you are familiar with some of the debates about how to address food security in light of climate change in sub-Saharan Africa. And there are kind of two contrasting approaches, and one is to do essentially more of the same with increased use of fossil fuel-based inputs, reliance on hybrid seeds, and sort of ramp up production in a part of the world where there is currently lower levels of use of fertilizer and pesticides and other inputs. And this approach tends to be pretty expert-driven, and also doesn't pay attention to the political and social dimensions, which are some of the driving causes of food insecurity and hunger in the world today. And in contrast to that is, and Alex made reference to this as part of his talk, the sort of agroecological approach to addressing food security, which tries to increase diversification of species, including livestock, integration of livestock back into food systems in some cases, maximizing biological control of disease and of pests, and minimizing the use of toxic inputs, and then really trying to recycle use of local resources, so organic material, energy, within systems, having as closed a loop as possible, and relying on local indigenous knowledge and building capacity for farmers to really observe and experiment with their agroecosystem and adapt their system based on what they've observed. So this approach often, and there's debate within agroecology, also takes into account political and social dimensions of the food system, including social inequality, including cultural dimensions of the food system, and things like access to land, access to seeds, control over seeds. So it's really a kind of a point of contention, a point of debate. And I'm sort of in the thick of this debate at the moment because I'm on this UN panel, which is looking at the potential for this approach to address food security and nutrition. In relation to climate change, and just narrowing in on Malawi, which is maybe a place you've never thought about before, I don't know. It's a small country in southern Africa. It's landlocked. It has a lake that takes up a big portion of the area, and it's a place where the majority of people rely on agricultural production for their livelihoods and for their food source. In terms of climate models, and we know that there is a lot of variability in what's predicted, but what is a general consensus from the latest reports that I looked at is that there will be increase in temperature. The precipitation rates, that is in doubt as to whether there will be increased precipitation or decrease, depending on where you live in Malawi, but increase in extreme weather events. And Malawi is already a place where there is persistent and chronic food insecurity. This map on the right, or your left here, is the latest prediction for the number of people who will be experiencing food insecurity this coming year. And you can see that it's about 3 million people. And that is a consistent story for the past several decades in Malawi, that of chronic food insecurity for a significant portion of the population. But it's also a place where people rely on hand-hoed agriculture and where women are actively involved in farming, and they make up about half of the labor force in agriculture. And it's a place you might be familiar with that crop in that picture, which is maize or corn, which makes up the majority of people's diets and makes up the majority of land area in Malawi. And so dietary diversity is an issue in Malawi. It's also a place which is very poor. The average income is about $320 per person per year. And interestingly, it's a place where this model of sustainable intensification has been really promoted heavily through fertilizer and hybrid seed subsidies given out to the majority of smallholder farmers, reducing the cost of fertilizer and hybrid seed. So it's a place where that model has really been pushed heavily, and it's a place where there's high levels of child stunting, high levels of malnutrition, undernutrition, with around 48% of kids being stunted for their age under 5. So it's a challenging place to try to address food security in light of climate change, to say the least. I've been working in Malawi for, 2 decades really, and some of the earlier work that I and my colleagues participated in, that we carried out, demonstrated that integrating more legumes into the cropping systems had multiple benefits for smallholder farmers. So this chart here shows that you get the same impact in terms of maize yield if you have a legume intercrop and then you rotate it with maize, but you bury the crop residue in the soil to add improved soil fertility. But if you have access to fertilizer, your fertilizer can be used more efficiently because the soil quality has improved. It's better able to retain nutrients in the soil. And that means you have reduced costs. So this is value-cost ratio. So you don't have to pay out as much in terms of the cost of fertilizer. And you have a more diversified diet because you're incorporating pigeon pea and groundnut and some of these delicious legumes that we heard Pinky mentioned earlier. And especially if you're using pigeon pea, which is a wonderful crop, and it's wonderful in part because it's a shrub, so it covers the soil for a longer period of time, and it's harvested later in the season, so that means that your soil has more soil cover longer. So these show promise for smallholder farmers in terms of these multiple benefits. And some of our work demonstrated that farmers who use these legume intercrops combined with community-based nutrition education have improved child growth. So in 2010, I and my colleagues, and I worked closely with a nonprofit organization in northern Malawi, as well as people in what is now called Luanar, but at that time was called Bunda College of Agriculture, and some colleagues at the University of Western Ontario in Canada. We began a 4-year research project really focusing on testing whether an agroecological approach combined with participatory research with farming households could lead to improvements in food security and nutrition. And we worked in 20 villages, 10 in the north and 10 in the central region of Malawi. And we asked communities to identify households who were highly food insecure or had other sort of indicators of vulnerability to climate change, including households who had someone in the family who was HIV positive. And we did some training with them on sort of agroecological principles, and then asked them to select what they wanted to do experiments on over the 4-year period. And they picked a wide range of options, including integrating agroforestry into their farming system, integrating more small and medium-sized livestock into their systems, using these legume intercrops, having crop diversification, including tubers and sorghum, which had previously sort of 100 years before been grown extensively in Malawi, but had largely disappeared from the landscape due to sort of political and social factors. And then a number of different sort of livelihood diversification strategies, like making clay pots that were more fuel efficient. And so we did a range of measurements, quantitative, qualitative, field-based measurements to look at the impact of these strategies over time. But importantly, it was a participatory approach. So farmers picked their own experiments to test, and they were involved in sort of assessing the impacts over time. And we also had a sort of big emphasis on the social inequalities that can impact on food security and nutrition. So I'm a sociologist by training, so you might not be surprised to hear me talk about the social impacts, but there's lots of evidence, and Alex made reference to this, that there are many drivers of food insecurity and nutrition that are not related to productivity. So gender inequality is one of them. Social inequality within communities is another one. And we've done a lot of work over the years on using different dialogue-based approaches to address those social inequalities. And I don't have the time to tell you about those at length, but these include sort of small group discussions and so on. There's my 5-minute warning, so I really don't have time. So what we found over time is that households increase the use of different incorporation of organic materials to improve soil fertility. And that headline at the front was supposed to come on, I think this might be a Mac versus PC thing, because it's not animating, but that headline just is a reference to the fact that incorporating these organic materials can actually act as a carbon sink. So even though we weren't focused on mitigation, it may increase soil carbon in the soils. And we also found an increased tree planting by households, not only on farmsteads, but also at community level, including organizing community-managed tree nurseries. And we know that afforestation in places like Malawi can be a significant source of carbon sinks as well. We found a significant increase in crop diversity, and this included more pigeon pea, more sorghum, and less tobacco, interestingly, which was not something we anticipated, and an increased amount of intercropping. And when we did multivariate analysis, we found that adding compost or manure was one of the significant determinants of household food security. And we found a significant improvement in household food security in the 3-year period where we measured household food security using the Household Food Security Access Scale, which is a standardized measure. And we saw an increase in household dietary diversity, which is sometimes used as a proxy for quality of people's diets. Interestingly for us, we also found that households who increased the amount of chatting that they did with their spouse about farming was one of the significant determinants of food security and dietary diversity. Households where spouses talked about farming were more likely to be food secure and have diverse diets, and that had changed. Initially, we had found only 10% of households where people chatted with their spouse about farming, which we thought was pretty fascinating. We then moved to a larger scale project working with 6,000 farmers in northern and central Malawi, using the same combination of agroecology, participatory research, and community-based education around gender and nutrition issues. And we really sort of ramped up the focus on gender, in part because of our findings from our earlier work, as that being a really significant factor in relation to malnutrition. And we, again, have been able to demonstrate that this strategy of, so this is the Malawi Farmer-to-Farmer Agroecology Project, that's what MAFA stands for. So people who participated in those community education programs and did increased agroecological practices on their farm, they were more likely to be food secure at the end of the project. Crop diversity was another significant factor associated with food security, controlling for other variables that affect food security. And we also found an increase in child intake of vitamin A-rich foods. that was significantly associated with crop diversity and with participation in these different community-based education programs. And so that's some of our work in Malawi, but we've taken this similar approach and applied it. I've worked it with colleagues in Tanzania with a nonprofit and university colleagues to test whether this kind of strategy can work in a very different context. And this is a project that is in its final year, funded by the McKnight Foundation. And Tanzania also has high levels of food insecurity, also has high levels of gender inequality, and has limited use of these agroecological strategies to improve food security. And after 3 years, we've seen an increase. In this case, we've used a delayed intervention design. So we have control households who will receive the intervention this final year of the project. And we're comparing those households to households who got a small amount of seeds and training at the beginning of the project, and then we've measured change over time. And they're using this peer mentoring strategy of farmer-to-farmer training. And we've seen an increase in crop diversity, increase in the use of these different integration of organic material back into the soil, and an increase in food security from those households who are using these in the intervention households. So we've seen significant improvements in food security, and interestingly for us, significant improvements in women's dietary diversity over time for households who are using these strategies. As well, we've been really interested in measuring change in gender relations, and we found a significant improvement in control, or at least having input into decision-making about food crops, about major and minor expenditures in the household for women. So this research points to agroecology as having the potential for improving food security in places where smallholder households are working. And we heard from Pinky that they make up a sizable proportion of the global population contributing to food security. We found in the case of Tanzania and Malawi that crop diversity and the use of incorporating organic material back into the soil are important strategies. Those strategies would likely vary by place, depending on what the farming system looks like. And this flexible participatory approach and attention to gender and social equity have been key components that we think have been drivers of the success in improving food security and nutrition. But in order to really address these and have a resilient food system overall, there are other pieces that need to be addressed, things like access to land, ensuring climate change mitigation is happening globally, and building local economies. So it's not like we fixed the problem, but these are pieces towards that problem. So I also work with many collaborators, and I just want to acknowledge many collaborators and a number of different funders. And I look forward to questions and discussion during the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So now, last but not least, Kavan Riney, and I will get his talk up. Hopefully. There it is.
Thanks, Tony. I jumped at the opportunity to participate in this symposium, largely because I've come to realize how big Rutgers is, and this is like a perfect opportunity to share my research with the different departments and schools and et cetera and et cetera. So this is part of the work that I've been doing for the past 7 or so years. And I wanted to just kind of provide a broad overview of some of the issues related to food security and climate change as it relates to the Caribbean. I changed my title a bit from lessons to insights, because I thought it's probably better and safer to say insights than lessons. So in terms of the Caribbean, I don't think it's any news that it's actually one of the most vulnerable regions as it relates to climate change. The Caribbean is at the forefront of future climate change assessments because of the kind of inherent vulnerabilities that the region has. For one, it's within the Mid-Atlantic hurricane belt. And so some of the projections in terms of future increases in extreme events this particularly relates to intense hurricanes, is a serious issue for the region. And we've seen over the past 10 years what has happened in terms of when a major hurricane hits a Caribbean island, like in the case of Grenada, where Hurricane Ivan led to the impacts of equivalent to 200% of that country's GDP. That took just pretty much 2 days, and you could literally see where an entire country was almost derailed because of that single hurricane event. In addition to that, the region is kind of dominated by small island developing states that are kind of low-lying, and that comes with its own set of unique vulnerabilities and sensitivities. Low-lying countries that are at risk of sea level rise, which has serious implications for water availability, but also the loss of land due to coastal inundation. Most of the region's physical and social infrastructure are actually located pretty much like a few kilometers from the coast. And so this presents this unique challenge we call a coastal squeeze, where because of limited area, limited land space, there's a lot of kind of challenges in even thinking about planned retreat from the coast because of those kind of unique biophysical characteristics. In addition to that, the region is very much dependent on a very limited range of sectors that are very much sensitive to changes in climate, particularly tourism, coastal forms of tourism, and also agriculture, which still contributes a significant amount of income, particularly for rural households, but is also very significant in terms of the labor, in terms of its contribution to the labor force. In addition to that, many Caribbean islands have a very limited capacity in terms of adaptation, limited resources, limitations in terms of human capacity, and so on. And so when you think about all of those different issues combined, climate change presents this kind of unique challenge that is constantly being framed as an existential threat throughout the Caribbean, as we've seen with the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign that was ramped up in the weeks leading up to the Paris Climate Agreement. So again, agriculture becomes kind of, it's at the forefront of debates because one of the kind of obvious kind of realities is the fact that the agricultural sector is probably one of the most vulnerable to future changes in climate. And what I want to do today is kind of focus on one dimension of food security, particularly looking at production, knowing very well that food security is a far more complex issue. But I want to focus on this because one of the time that I have to share my work with you, but also because this is one of the areas in which the region is kind of focusing a lot of its time and resources on in terms of creating what I call resilient climate subjects, and kind of thinking about some of the implications of that. So when we think about the type of impacts that climate change presents to the agricultural sector, there's a whole range in terms of the impacts from extreme events, shifting seasonal rainfall patterns, longer-term shifts in agroecological zones, and sea level rise, and so on. But what's also quite important, and I want to make it clear, is that there are a whole range of other factors. Climate change is pretty much a multiplier as opposed to something that is happening on its own. And so when you kind of map climate change onto other issues related to, in this case, the local farming sector, you realize that the issue as climate change pretty much compounds these sort of underlying forces or drivers of vulnerability. And so a lot of the work that's being done in the region is kind of focused on what the Caribbean might look like in the next coming decades. And there's a lot of focus within the agricultural sector in terms of mapping out, visualizing what these future changes might represent, might present in terms of challenges for different sectors, particularly for the agricultural sector. So what we've seen is a whole range of different models, kind of looking at different kind of modeling that have pretty much looked at different scenarios and looking at what these different scenarios mean for the agricultural sector. And this is just one example of some of these results in Jamaica. And one of the general trends that we're seeing from the climate models is that the region is expected to see a decrease, an increase in average temperatures. And there is some agreement that the region will go through this kind of drying trend. But there's still a lot of uncertainty around that. But what is kind of, there's a greater agreement around the fact that we'll see an increase in variability. So in other words, these kind of shifts in terms of the different rainy seasons when they will start, is going to become particularly more important in terms of how farmers have to kind of arrange and organize their cropping systems. Particularly when it comes on to the start of the early rainy season, which many farmers in the region, largely because these are kind of small-scale farmers that are practicing open field agriculture, so the kind of slightest changes that take place in terms of these seasonal rainfall patterns will have a significant impact on their livelihoods. I'm using this example of Jamaica largely because I've been doing a lot of work in that country to kind of show that these changes kind of also map onto other sort of kind of biological and physical constraints. So if you look at this particular graphic, what I'm trying to show here is that with these projected changes, what's happening is that suitability, especially for the agricultural sector, is shifting further towards higher altitudes. And as you see this shift in terms of higher altitudes, you're seeing this change in land use practices as well. So for one, you could see where there's going to be serious implications for instance, forests and protected areas. So as there's this sort of shift towards suitability from low-lying areas to higher grounds, one of the type of decisions that we're going to have to make is, what are we going to allow in these high altitude areas in terms of different land use practices. We've also seen this, this is a recent paper that we just published in Regional Environmental Change, kind of looking at different scenarios between RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. And what I'll just point out here is if you look at, say, like the common bean, you can see that there's significant changes in terms of suitability, right? So what's generally happening is as you move towards these higher temperature thresholds, you're going to lose more suitability in low-lying areas, and those suitability is going to shift towards higher altitude regions that already have limited land space. The other point I want to make is that it's not as simple as that, right? So when you think about climate change issues and you map that on to what the reality looks like, it's very complex. So this is some work that I've been doing with the IRI from Columbia University along with the University of Arizona. And we were kind of looking at the coffee industry and just kind of mapping out different type of factors that have been affecting that industry over the past few decades. And kind of what you can see here is that farmers, especially within this sector, have to be dealing with a whole range of different shocks, right? Moving from climate-related shocks, climate-induced shocks, to also changes in market prices, increased costs of inputs, and so on. So it's a very complex issue that has to be dealt with in a very kind of systemic and systematic way. And what I'll do is to spend the next few minutes kind of talking about some of the current response pathways. I'm going to focus on just two areas that I've been involved with, and there's some similarities with some of the presentations from before. So climate information services and crop varietal research. This is certainly, there's several projects that I've been involved with that's kind of been looking at this. And then in terms of thinking about all these other factors in terms of how you can frame them, so there's a lot of focus on infrastructure and infrastructural development, science and innovation, capacity building. And in terms of the work around science and information, there's been a lot of focus on developing like early warning systems, creating metrics that can map out what the future world might look like. And then a lot of the policies that are being made now are being shaped by what these metrics are telling us in terms of what the future might look like. And that's something I'm also kind of interested in as well, to think about the work that metrics, the work that models do in terms of shaping policy. So climate information systems is a fairly new type of idea, but it's a very relevant idea. It's kind of thinking about the type of data that the climate science community is creating. What type of data is being created? How is this data being distributed? Who is using this information? How is this information mapping onto the needs of specific end user communities? What's the type of politics that's tied into what gets included and what gets excluded from climate science information? And then how does that shape policies and in turn practices on the ground? And so there's a whole range of different metrics in the region that we're using now. And one of the interesting things is kind of thinking about how providing information ties into behavior. So the 2014 drought was actually predicted. Across the region, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology was actually able to predict that 2014 drought. That information was actually provided to different countries. It didn't do anything. No one actually took it seriously. So since then, there's been a lot of growing interest in terms of thinking about the potential of actually integrating climate information in various sectors. But there is a lot of debate around this because of the limitations, as Alex actually pointed out, with climate science information itself. There's really a serious issue about how credible different end user communities kind of see climate information and in terms of and view climate information in terms of shaping their practices. So this is something that I'm particularly interested about. I don't have enough time to get into this, but I'm happy to talk to different folks about this, particularly in terms of how this can be applied even here in the United States. The other kind of project that I've been involved with is kind of similar to what Rachel mentioned. It's kind of this participatory work. This is a 3-year-long project that's funded under the pilot program for climate resilience. And what we're doing is we're kind of working with several different scientists, plant physiologists. We're working with a team from Colombia, looking at crop niche modeling. So this is part of the CGIAR group. And what we're doing is we're working with like 5 different crops, but we're working at the cultivar level. And we're looking at crops that aren't necessarily important globally, but are important regionally. So these are crops that have kind of been overlooked by climate science research, but they are very much important in terms of local economies. And what we're doing is trying to come up with a metric to identify resilient varieties of these different cultivars for specific crops, using a plant screening methodology, and then introducing this to farmers. And what we're doing is we're doing 2 things. We're working with farmers who will just take these different varieties. They don't know which varieties we identify as resilient, using that term broadly, and then mapping that onto their existing practices. And then we will have another group that's going to be working with extension officers. That's going to be kind of there'll be greater intervention with that group. And over time, what we'll be doing is kind of going back and assessing those different groups to see if there's been kind of any difference in terms of performance for these different varieties. And then from that result, we'll then start to have a dialogue with policymakers, farmers, and different stakeholder groups to kind of come up with a methodology for kind of guiding the region in terms of future methods of selecting resilient cultivars for particular crops that are seen as important to the region. So it's a multi-site project. It involves a whole range of different folks. But pretty much, when we think about the potential going forward, one of the things that I've kind of seen as very important is incorporating farmers, incorporating different stakeholder groups into the work that we do to co-produce co-benefits. So that's something that is very important. And I certainly agree with Alex in terms of the point that the problem that this presents is so complex that there's no one discipline that can solve this problem. But I also want to add that that academics alone and researchers alone cannot solve the problem as well. And we're realizing that there's a very important role for local knowledge, for working with different end user groups, and for research that's more demand driven as opposed to top down. And I'll stop it for there, but I hope that we can have a nice opportunity to talk, to share more of my work with folks. And again, thanks very much for having me.
So before we move on, let's thank all of our panelists again one more time for their presentations and for keeping things moving along at a pretty good pace here. So if this were a Broadway play, the curtain would come down now so that we could change the set. But the change in set is happening right in front of us, courtesy of our helpers here from the Bush Student Center. And as soon as they get the tables ready, which we thoughtfully moved so that they wouldn't block your view of the screen, those of you sitting over on that side of the room, we'll ask our panelists to come up and we'll have an opportunity for them to respond to questions. What I'm going to do in the panel part is pose the first question, and then I'm hoping that subsequent questions will come from all of you, again, following our practice of allowing students to ask questions first, and anyone who wants to ask a question coming up to the microphone up front so that everyone can be heard. So as soon as I get the go-ahead from Marjorie, who's putting up the tent cards for identifying our panelists, we will get started. She had asked me to do a song and dance up here while this was going on. This time I didn't take her instructions literally, which is a good thing for all of you. But so I think we're probably ready enough that we can ask our panelists to come up and take a seat here. Okay, I see microphone lights coming on and I hear feedback, so I think that's telling us that something's working. So while we're getting everything ready, I'll pose the first question. And then what I'd like to do, the way we'll try to work the panel is if panelists can keep their responses concise, we'd like to give each person who wants to respond a chance to respond to the question. And if there are any interesting interactions that grow out of those responses, we can let those play out a little bit. But again, the idea here is to provide time for a good number of questions, and we have about 20 minutes before we have to move on. So my first question is this. The second UN development goal is zero hunger. Can we collectively achieve this goal without significantly increasing our carbon footprint? So whoever wants to start can start. I started you off with an easy question, so.
Can I shout? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so the challenge that we're having with food security now is not necessarily linked to just production levels. A lot of the issues related to food security is kind of linked to nutrition, it's linked to access. And so I think in terms of thinking about meeting of the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly around food security, climate change is part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. And so there are ways in which we can meet those goals without having negative impacts in terms of greenhouse emissions and so on. So that's kind of one way I'd probably add to that.
Can I add? Sorry, Rachel, you want to go?
Yeah, I'd like to second that. I mean, hunger is a lot to do with power and a lot to do with, I mean, we have hunger in this country, and it isn't because we are producing greenhouse gas emissions per se, but it has to do with people being poor. Someone didn't like that answer. As I was saying, it has to do with unequal access to money, right? It has to do with poverty. It has to do with structural inequalities in the system, which are often racial, which are gendered, class-based inequalities. And so I think you can tackle those if you have the political will and address undernutrition and overnutrition, which would, if you did it right, you could actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But it would require significant political will. If you look at a country like Brazil, not in the current moment, but in the last 2 decades, they actively sought to reduce malnutrition by addressing questions of poverty and land access. So, yeah, unrelated to greenhouse gas emissions, really. I see those as being, it's possible, but it would require significant political will.
So if I may add something to it. So I agree with both of them, and Rachel mentioned a little bit about affordability. The other thing that we also need to think about is accessibility, and that might not be a case in every country, but some countries, there are foods available in the markets, but not everyone can get to that market because they live in such remote places. And most of the developing countries, tropical countries, there has been a problem. I have been to India. I mean, I have been working in India for such a long time now. And when I grew up in a city, but when I travel to remote places in India and I see that they have access to a market that comes on just once a week, and they do not have refrigerators, right? So they cannot really store food, buy enough for an entire week or a month, and just store that food. So even if there's a lot of food items available at those markets, just by default, just not having access to a storage capacity, they cannot get those foods. So they will probably have chicken just once a month. So, and all of us who work in these sectors, we talk a lot about accessibility, availability, affordability, and all those are the pillars of food and nutrition security. So I totally agree with Kevon and Rachel here that it's not so much about production. We still produce a lot of food right now. We don't know about future. I mean, we are not that hopeful probably. But right now it's more like the distribution and the leakage through storage.
Can I
Briefly.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Give you the last word.
Okay.
I'll briefly talk about the perspective for fisheries, which I think really are a win-win case, because right now there's actually a decent amount of potential for larger food production from the ocean if we just don't fish as hard. In many cases where we basically have too many boats trying too hard to catch fish, the population sizes are too small. And therefore, that's more fuel being burned to catch fewer fish. If we actually let the populations rebound, it'll be easier, take less fuel, less effort, less greenhouse gas emissions from fisheries, and actually more food production in the future. It just requires, some of those governance challenges I was talking about today, right? Constraining that race to fish, and agreements to jointly limit fishing efforts. So it's not a race.
Let me see if okay. Is it working? Yeah. So what I'm gonna say is a little controversial, but I think if you followed my presentation, the underlying tone is probably you understood that I'm a big fan of sort of moving away from just focusing on production and of alternative methods that are not just chemical fertilizers and chemical inputs and so on. However, I want to say that I think we're talking about big numbers in terms of productivity, in terms of reduction of emissions. These are big numbers, and I have the feeling that without bringing bringing to the table in a meaningful way set of companies and part of the private industry that we tend to work in an alternative way, I have the feeling that we're not going to be able to meet those goals. And I know this is a difficult topic because they do a lot of the things that we try to avoid, but I think that they have access to the actual big potential for delivery, both in food security and reduction of emissions.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Come on up to the microphone, please.
Hello, my name is Sheena Foster, and I'm a student at UDC in urban sustainability. So, as we know, many small share farmers not only use the land for harvest, but for food security and job security, and oftentimes they also live on the land. While climate change is an ongoing challenge, the impact of agrotech on small share ag production in sub-Saharan Africa and in the Caribbean could have just a devastating impact on farmers. So while solving one problem, we're creating another. So what are some of the solutions and best practices that you are aware of that farmers can use to survive the disruption of ag technology?
That's a huge question. I almost feel like I need a clarifying question here. In terms of the disruption of agricultural technology, that seems like a big group of possibilities.
Like harvesting, not fintech, because I think that kind of works well, but like harvesting machines and things that are taking the place of the actual physical labor of farmers. And to clarify, there's a lot of multinational companies and that are from the U.S. or from the West that are coming in with businesses, with tech businesses, primarily to invest. A lot of expats are coming in and taking over the labor market with ag technology. So climate change is one issue, but ag tech is also creating food insecurity and job insecurity, because where do the farmers go when they can't live on the land, when they can't eat from the land that they've once harvested for the sell of?
Okay, now I understand your question. And I'd like to take a crack at it and actually sort of in counter to what Alex has said. I think that those big companies are already at the table. I mean, they're really in the driver's seat of our food system at the moment. Whether you're talking about the input side or whether you're talking about the retail side, there's a very small number, highly concentrated industry, and there's lots of documentation to point to that, with some great ag economists who have done some of that documentation. So, for example, there's some great work out of Michigan State showing the rising concentration of industry. And yes, there's increased foreign land acquisition, sometimes called land grabs. Africa's been one of the frontiers for that, but it's happening in many other parts of the world. And it doesn't often or always benefit local communities. They're not always producing food that addresses food insecurity. They're often producing products that then go into the market and can lead to, overnutrition, lead to health problems for those of us in the West. So I think it's a big problem. I think it requires regulation of foreign land acquisition and governments being able to take a stand and saying, no, we need to protect this land for smallholder farmers. We need to prioritize those who are producing food for our country. That's in contrast to sort of open borders, anything goes. And some countries have taken a stand. Of course, Madagascar is a kind of classic case of that, saying, no, we're not going to allow a large company to take over a huge proportion of our land and produce for export. We're going to not permit that after public protests. So I think it also requires public input and people paying attention to what's happening in their country and being willing to mobilize civil society and put pressure on governments to listen to what's happening in their communities. that would be my response.
And I'll probably add to that in saying that I think there is a space on the table for multiple modes of production. I think to a large extent, small-scale farmers are sometimes seen as a problem, when I think there is a lot of potential for kind of tapping into the work that small-scale farmers are doing. They're not going anywhere, because if you think about the global south, the large majority of farmers in the global south are small-scale farmers. So there has to be a space around the table for small-scale farming. I think the question is, and tying back to what Alex mentioned earlier in his talk, can small-scale farming be efficient? Can it be sustainable? I think that's a big question that we have to ask ourselves. And I think the answer is yes. I think there is a range of opportunities for small-scale production to be sustainable through agroecological works, through mapping into the existing practices, sustainable land management techniques through farmer field schools, these kind of peer-to-peer learning strategies. And so in that regard, I think one of the big challenges that we have today is the sort of politics, the kind of governance issues that's kind of driving what happens within the supply chains that feed the majority of the world, that in many cases benefit these large corporate entities at the expense of smallholder farmers. And I think that's a big issue that we need to deal with within the policy community.
Anyone else have a comment?
I'll give my 2 cents. This is another incredibly complicated question, and particularly I'm thinking about the land grabbing issue, which is not just, by the way, I didn't mention it during my presentation, but it doesn't happen only through forms of international companies and actors and go and acquire the land in this country. It can be, like in Colombia, for instance, one of the main issues in the way that livestock and pasture land is inefficiently used is because domestically, these are domestic actors, is a form of land grabbing. It's a way of controlling the land. So it doesn't happen only because of mean people from the multinational companies. I don't know, I think that these things need to be negotiated in the political arena of each country. Because honestly, particularly being a person who's from Washington, lobbies, political, and we're always perceived as a foreign actor that comes there with all the knowledge and a set of recipes that we can provide, and if people follow them, they're fine. I'm trying to avoid that, sort of projecting that image. And on the other hand, who am I to say that, if you protect this little group of trees, yes, you're not going to have land grabbing and we're going to solve some environmental issues, but at the same time, I don't know, you cannot send your kids to school and become a doctor and have a better life. So what I'm trying to say is that many complicated issues that I think one way to, the only thing I can think of solving them is to try to do our job as researchers, understand what the issues are, and provide them openly for a discussion and empower local communities. Then what happens, just like what happens in this country, okay, will have to be decided in the political arena. It isn't something that researchers can solve. It isn't something that that it's easily addressed just because we know that it's a problem. If there is a problem, there are also many, many reasons why that problem exists. Many interests and people who benefit. And they're not necessarily people mean-spirited people who are gaining from that situation. It could be entire communities, even locally.
So I think we have time for about 2 more questions. So who is our next? Okay, Ben, come on up to the mic.
I think most of you use climate models, climate model output, and I guess I'm wondering what else would you like to see in terms of what climate models provide that might help inform the kind of impact assessments that you do better? Is it, or I mean, probably the resolution of the data and so on, but I'm curious if the way data from climate models is currently provided, there would be recommendations for how it would be better used by you for what you do.
The question is, are there ways that information from climate models could be provided that would be more useful than what is currently being provided?
So I will modify your question a little bit because I collaborate with crop climate modelers. So those models definitely have some information input from climate, but we are trying to integrate crop responses. Some of those models, and I'm not an expert, so I'll just tell you this, what I know, some of those crop climate models do not have modules for adaptation strategies. So when we build those scenarios, we are just trying to change different climatic parameters for different crops. But what if there are some adaptation strategies already on the ground? So when I go out in the field and talk to the farmers, they're probably doing something right. But there's no way to bring that information into those crop climate models and hopefully in your future, because we as scientists are identifying this gap in this knowledge, and we are hoping that in the upcoming modeling frameworks, we would have a module for adaptation strategies where we can tweak those parameters to see that not only the negative ones, but also if something positive going on the field, on the ground, how is that going to change the scenarios?
In some ways, you already provided my answer because you mentioned resolution. And the resolution of climate models is exceptionally coarse, both in terms of time and space compared to what a fish or a squid experiences, right? And I don't think that's necessarily all on the climate modeling community, right? A lot of that has to do with, do we understand the relationship between large-scale averages that come out of a climate model and then the fine-scale heterogeneous environment that organisms inhabit? And if that relationship stays the same, then we're probably fine. But if it changes as the climate changes, that's where it gets challenging for us. I guess the second thing I'd mention is that organisms are responding to more than just temperature and some of the other aspects that come out of the climate models. Oxygen, especially in the ocean, is incredibly important, and that's not in many of the models right now.
That's actually, the question you ask is a question I constantly ask myself. And I think what I'm particularly interested in is not necessarily what else can be included, but more about why we include what we include in climate models and the type of work that does. So for me, if you ask me for my wish list, I would definitely want more socioeconomic data in climate models, and certainly at higher resolution. But there are certain things that just cannot be modeled. And so to turn that question around, I could ask them, what are the limitations of climate models? And if we understand the limitations of climate models, does it mean that climate models aren't useful? I don't think so. I think climate models are still useful in terms of looking at different scenarios. But then how can we act in a context of increasing uncertainty and complexity? And I think a lot of that question and the answers to those questions kind of link more to issues of governance and development issues that have always been there. And I think kind of asking those questions open up the discussion to some very interesting areas for the type of work that we do.
If I may add one item to the wish list, besides the resolution, is variability. For lots of reasons, we end up working with these trends, and we're forced, for lots of reasons, not just the climate model's fault, also economists, we're forced to work with risk-neutral agents, which is, the thing is, it's the farthest from how farmers actually are reacting. And so we need to bring risk into the analysis, extreme events, because they might have, actually, I know that they probably have a stronger impact on how farmers are reacting than this longer change in trends. And so we need that information. I know you guys are working, I'm assuming that you're working with climate models, you're working on that, but it has to come, we're ready for it. That's all I'm saying.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. As our last questioner comes up to the microphone, I will point out there's a lot of information about variability that's available in climate model simulations. I think part of the issue is how to transmit and communicate that information.
Thank you all for your diverse perspectives on this very, very complicated issue. I wanted to ask for further comments on, I really appreciated, Alex, your three-pronged approach that seems necessary to kind of consider the trade-offs when we're thinking about sustainability, we're thinking about adaptability, we're thinking about efficiencies and emissions and things like that. And so it seems that the big corporate model or even just bigger farms models might have something to learn for efficiencies, and there is something to be gained from large scale, but the agroecology model might be teaching us something about adaptability and smaller, microclimate changes that we're going to be facing and things like that. So my question is, for your perspective on what are some examples of policies or practices that are trying to find that middle ground to learn from the scale and the larger corporate kind of model, but also to learn from the wisdom of the thousands of years of farming and adapting to changes in the environment?
Another easy question for our panel.
You guys are asking really, really difficult questions. I don't have an example. I wish I had one. I cannot think of one that it's, maybe you do, yeah.
I can think of one. It might not be popular in this country, but Cuba is an interesting example because it worked large-scale industrial farming during the Soviet regime, fertilizer, large-scale intensification model. But then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they lost access to fertilizer and support that was able to sustain that model. And so they began a transition to essentially an agroecological model. They had a roster of scientists to draw on. They had a national agricultural system to draw on, which maybe made it easier, but at the same time they had small-scale farmers using agroecological methods already and sort of farmer-to-farmer peer learning. And so there's been a lot of research done on Cuba's ability to produce food even under an embargo, and it's something like, I'm scared to pull a number, but it's maybe about a third of farmers who are using agroecological systems, and despite an embargo, able to produce enough food, largely reliant on agroecological methods. So there was this combination of drawing from sort of science and industrial approaches, but also drawing heavily on farmer-to-farmer and agroecological small-scale approaches. One of the interesting things about Cuba as well is there's been a flourishing of urban agriculture, small-scale urban agriculture. And the state has been actively involved in that. So that would be one hopeful example. Another example in another part of the world, which is, I would say, flourishing at a slower pace, is France, which has made a commitment to trying to transition to agroecological systems through some, state support, but also drawing on regional initiatives in the country that have been trying to foster organic and agroecological methods at a regional scale. So that's an interesting, contrast. So I would say those would be two windows of hopefulness where different strategies are being melded together.
Some of these issues also, some of the barriers that prevent some of the agroecology adoption or kind of smart agriculture also are due to policies that are in place. Say, in Malawi, they have a strong fertilizer subsidies on fertilizers, and sort of all these alternatives, agroforestry, rotations that are definitely beneficial for soil, soil fertility, reduce emissions, and so on, they're just drowned by the advantages of having, these fertilizers ready and available. And it's not just that. I mean, other issue that it's problematic, the price of water. But it's also true. I mean, I know that it is a difficult issue politically, but if you were to price water correctly in some areas, you would definitely reduce emissions. Because then the barrier for adoption of practices that are water-saving practices. Right now, there's no advantage in using them. Actually, they might be more labor-intensive, and they require learning processes. There's a policy aspect. There's a knowledge issue. Well, I'm glad to hear that there are good examples, at least, and we can draw from that.
I think it's policy, but it's also politics as well. There is a strong hold on the global agri-food system that these large corporate entities have. And sometimes that prevents us from seeing alternative ways of doing things. And I think there are inefficiencies in large-scale farming as well. When you think about the work around banana coppers, if you think about the fact that there are kind of growing dependence on these kind of large-scale monocropping systems, is actually opening up ourselves to a large type of high vulnerability to plant diseases. You could literally lose most of your banana varieties in a few years by just kind of growing so dependent on a limited range of these varieties. That's not because of small-scale agriculture, that's because of the type of mass production for this type of production systems that we've seen dominating the global agri-system for the past several decades. So I think there is both benefits and kind of limitations with both models. But I think that we've kind of focused so much on one model because of the type of stake and power that those groups actually have. And there's a need for us to kind of come to the table and share ideas. So we operate in silos, I think, and that's part of the problem.
So Malin and Pinky, chance for last words here?
I'll say something quickly. There's been some really interesting work on small-scale fisheries. I think for a long time they've been largely ignored, and yet most fishers out there are very small-scale. And folks like Bonnie McKay and Heather Leslie have done really interesting work on places where fishers have come together and actually self-organized cooperatives that then manage themselves, in some cases, quite effectively. Places like Baja, Mexico have done a good job. And on the other side, actually, some of the very large-scale fishing operations are heavily subsidized by the government, so fuel subsidies end up being a big motivation to be very large and travel all over the world catching fish, and often catching too many. So actually reducing subsidies in some cases will result in a shift towards smaller scale.
So I guess I get the last word. So
You do.
I would agree with all of them that I believe the subsidies are extremely misplaced. Many parts of the world where we have groundwater depletion going out rapidly, we have high subsidies on groundwater extraction. So that doesn't help the environment. That doesn't really helping the farmers in the longer run. So I recently learned about an initiative that are actually taking away the subsidy, but that's actually linking the mechanism of pulling groundwater out with a solar panel so that the farmer is actually extracting as much as needed, but also producing energy for that. So, and if he's not using up that much of energy, he's giving back. So it looks like a good model, and we will see when we scale it up how well it works. But definitely we have to think about putting subsidies on the right places. It's a good way for the politicians to go out in the field just before an election and tell them, okay, we are going to give you whatever you want. And I'll just promise you to give tube wells or some sort of heavy subsidies so that you can get as much water as you can get, and you do not have to pay for your electricity bills. I'm going to subsidize for that. That's not going to help.
Well, with that, I think we have to end our panel discussion. So let's thank our panelists again. Not only for this discussion, but also for their presentations today.